Welcome, everybody. We're about to get started here. Just getting attendance. Let's see, Ethan's here. Kenzie. But I'm just writing down all the people who are here. Reading more. We may actually go a little longer today. One of the things that I just found out was that we're going to have to give everybody work on Wednesday, and then we're trying to figure out some kind of hybrid schedule or something. So, and then Friday I will be at a thing where I'm setting standards for history for U.S. history for the state of Tennessee. So I won't be around then. So I'll probably end up going till about 2 o'clock today instead of 1. So if you need to drop out early, that's fine. But there'll be 3 questions instead of 2, just because we're not going to be able to cover a lot of stuff in class this week. Yes, go ahead, Zach.
Will we get credit for the attendance if we just stay to 1 like it was scheduled for?
Well, but then there'll be that 3rd question. So it's like basically 1 question per hour. So if you wanted to, if you want to get credit for that 3rd one, just stay the extra. If you don't, just do the written part for the extra one. Up to you, however you want to do it. Let's see. There were some people who showed up that I missed. All right, wait, Alicia. Please. Just trying to make sure I got everybody. So did y'all see the news? The latest news?
Biden's projected to win.
Yep, Biden won.
Biden won according to the media. Of course, that's not official yet, but they're kind of basically saying they're calling it. So, yeah. Then apparently there was this computer software that we used to count votes that glitched in Michigan, where it was giving people who voted for Biden, it was giving people who voted for Trump it was switching their vote to Biden. So, and apparently that software is used in 30 states.
Not in Tennessee.
Yeah, you see the ones that are red there. So yeah, so I don't know if there's some kind of like, switch where you could manually switch it, or if if it was defective like the same way in every place. But yeah, of course that's going to raise some questions as well. So
I would guess by how results are looking now at that point, that glitch would be like a 1 in 1,000 sort of thing. Be
yeah,
like small.
You know computer systems better than most, so yeah. Yeah. We'll see, but
quick question.
Yeah.
You said something about Wednesday. What's happening Wednesday?
I just got an email from Mr. Red who said that we're going to give everybody work. So I'm going to give you something to do instead of having class with you. I'm supposed to give you something to do because we're supposed to meet that day and talk about, how we're going to do a hybrid schedule, which I don't see why we would need to meet for the entire day. That doesn't make any sense to me, but that's what
What's
we're
happening?
apparently. I'm supposed to give you work on Wednesday because we're having some sort of meeting. So instead of me having a live class with you, we're supposed to work. I'm supposed to give you work. So that's why I'm kind of going for a little longer today than I normally would, because, you know, we're just trying to keep up with the calendar and make sure we get everything covered. All right. Let me go back and pick up. Oh, that's quarter one. Oh, quarter two. All right. So I believe this is the last slide we did. Wait. Or no, actually, for those of you in fourth hour, did we do the Indian Removal Act?
No.
No.
No, okay.
No.
But we did do, I do remember we did do Barron v. Baltimore. So we're only a couple slides off here of where the other class got to. All right. And I want to make sure I've got, oh yeah, and I need to pull up the new rotation. Get that up real fast. And quarter two. All right. Okay. So it looks like we're now finally ready to go. All right. So the Indian Removal Act was aimed at one of the few tribes that had managed to hold on to its lands in the East, and that was the Cherokee. The Cherokee, of course, are in a very large area, which was most of kind of the southern Appalachian range. That included parts of Georgia, parts of it's called the Blue Ridge Mountains in Georgia, parts of Tennessee, parts of North Carolina, parts of actually Virginia, a little bit of Virginia as well. And so that, you know, the Smokies, Eastern Tennessee, all of that area was home to the Cherokee. And basically, they had attempted to stay where they were by getting a by basically turning themselves into white people almost. They dress like white people. So you can see here, here's Chief John Ross. He looks like a Southern planter. And a member of their tribe named Sequoia had created a written language for the Cherokee. And they actually owned land. Some of them owned plantations and owned slaves. And just the fact that they weren't white and they were on land that white people wanted and they were jealous, basically kind of increased pressure to push a federal law through that would remove them from their lands. And President Jackson, this is where he gets his bad reputation oftentimes. Like you say, hey, why should Andrew Jackson's statue be pulled down? And they would say, and people would say, the Trail of Tears, which actually doesn't happen under his presidency, but it is because of this law. Now, just remember that there's a lot of other people involved as well. Yes, he does sign it into law. Yes, he is known as an Indian fighter. And you know, so to a certain extent, he very much does deserve his reputation, but he also is you know, only part of a much larger movement here where people want to get rid of the Cherokee for, you know, selfish reasons, many of them. So there are some court challenges where the Cherokee, you know, attempt to press their rights in court. In Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, the court basically says that the Cherokee don't even have any standing at all to bring a case. And like I was mentioning in 6th block, if you want to bring a case before the court, you have to have what's called standing. So like if you were going to sue somebody, you would have to be an injured party in order to sue them. Like if you're not, if you're just some bystander, you don't have any standing. But so, and essentially the reason that they didn't have standing was because they weren't citizens. But in Worcester v. Georgia, the court stated that laws regarding the Cherokee were invalid because only the feds had the right to make those laws. Now, the Cherokee saw Worcester v. Georgia as a huge victory. They were like, yes, you know, finally we won. And this is where Andrew Jackson kind of lives up to his anti-Native American reputation. And he says, well, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. He wasn't going to go down there and enforce a decision against white Southerners in favor of Native Americans. And so, yeah, he definitely lives up to his reputation as someone who does not like Native Americans. All right, so that takes us to the Second Seminole War. And yeah, somebody covered this in Sixth Hour, but in Fourth Hour we still haven't done it yet. But basically, the Seminole tribe, as we discussed earlier, is this conglomeration of you know, various tribes, the remnants of various tribes, and escaped slaves. They were holding on to their lands in Florida, especially kind of in the swampy areas in the middle of Florida. Basically, the federal government was trying to get them out of Florida to open it up completely to white settlement. So you have a lot of them moving west. 3,800 of them had moved west of the Mississippi by 1834, but the larger part of the tribe remained under the leadership of a guy named Osceola. And the tensions continued to grow until an Indian agent was killed in 1835, and this touched off a war between the federal government and the Seminole. President Jackson does send troops in to try to remove the Seminoles. So if you were looking for, you know, where did Andrew Jackson actually send in troops to remove Native Americans, this would be the case right here. But it doesn't work out quite the way he wants it to, because the Seminole are brilliant in what we call guerrilla warfare. And so U.S. forces don't do well against the Seminole, and they keep on sending more and more forces, keep on getting ambushed out in the kind of the Everglades area of Florida. And eventually we have to sign a humiliating truce. Yes, Chase, go ahead.
Did the war, like the nation for the Indians, did they have like internal conflicts like they did before, or did they finally like set all of that aside?
Unfortunately for the Native Americans, there is no Tecumseh who will unite them all. Because just remember that, like, just because we've beat the tribes east of the Mississippi, that doesn't mean that there aren't very powerful tribes to the west of the Mississippi. Now, there will be a case, when we'll get to this, when we get into the late 1800s, where Native American tribes will all unite together, and they will humiliate us. They will beat our post-Civil War army, like hands down, and force us to give them a giant chunk of the American West for a while. And you'll see how we beat them. I won't spoil it, but whenever the tribes unite, it spells huge trouble for us. So that's actually an excellent question. Unfortunately for the natives, they just don't have another visionary like Tecumseh who could unite them all. Their old rivalries stretch back thousands of years. I mean, and it's only been, a little bit over 100 years that they've been dealing with the white man for the most part. So good question. Braden, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something?
You kind of answered it, just going on. So.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, anyway, so when they signed the truce, and this reminds me of the whole Haiti episode with Toussaint L'Ouverture versus the French. When when white people get desperate, you know, sort of thing. Although that's not necessarily always true. But I've seen this. Europeans have done this to each other a lot. Like if you took AP Euro, you'd see in the peasant rebellions, they do this. They say, okay, you win. We're going to give you a bunch of land. Come sign the troop. Come negotiate the peace treaty with us. And then, of course, what do they always do when that happens? What they do to Toussaint Louverture? Anybody?
They didn't let it happen. They killed him.
No, they killed.
They killed him.
They're like, if we could just get our hands on this guy who is their leader, maybe then they won't be so good. And so they basically arrest Osceola, throw him in prison. Osceola will later die in prison, but the Seminole continue to fight on until 1842. And finally, after that, they are forced to go west of the Mississippi for the most part. Although there will be some remnants that manage to kind of hide out in the Everglades. Chase, you have your hand up still. Did you want to say something else, or did you just forget to put it down?
Oh, I forgot to put it down.
All righty. All right. So that takes us to Samuel Colt and the revolver, and this is actually Dylan's slide. So Dylan, are you ready?
Yes.
All right. Great. So Dylan, I'm going to give you the floor, and then I'll just jump in every so often. But go ahead.
Okay. So in 1830, Samuel Colt's father sent him on a voyage on the ship the Corvo. And while on the ship's wheel inspired him to make a pistol with 6 revolving chambers, allowing for 6 shots without reloading. And once after the voyage, he developed a prototype for the gun, and then he acquired patents for it, a British patent in 1835 and an American patent in 1836. And then he developed not a prototype, but his first actual gun, the Patterson. And he went for a government contract, but was turned down because the Army deemed the gun too innovative and therefore unreliable. And then, so he made small sales in the Republic of Texas and in Florida during the Second Seminole War. And then in 1884, when James K. Polk was expanding into U.S. territory into Texas, Colt received an order of 1,000 revolvers from General Zachary Taylor, which was his first big purchase. And then the revolving gun had a huge impact on war, allowing one person to defend against multiple attackers. And it was used in wars such as the Mexican-American War and the American Civil War, and is still used today in the U.S. Army, which adopted the Colt 1911 from 1911 to 1986.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So the revolver, and of course, when we get to the Wild West, you know, the revolver will be the weapon of choice. It really does change the American West in so many ways. What happens to ammunition? Because before you had like a bag of gunpowder, and you would pour gunpowder down the barrel, and then you would take the excuse me, the bullet, and you would stuff it down there. What is changing here in terms of the ammunition? How is the ammunition now packaged?
He developed a cartridge that held the gunpowder and the bullet in one package.
Yes, and of course that is what we now commonly refer to as the bullet, because it has the extra part on the bullet that basically holds the gunpowder. And so that was one of the biggest innovations in terms of, because it's going to open up possibilities for all other kinds of guns as well. Yeah, this is a huge step forward in terms of our military technology, which of course is going to be used on the frontier extensively as well. All right, excellent job. Did you have any quotes or clips or anything that you wanted to add in?
No.
No? Okay. Great job. And that takes us, I really don't have anything to add. I think you pretty much covered everything. So that takes us to a story that I find hilarious. I mean, and I know assassination attempts are not, anything to sneeze at. I mean, they're not, but I love Andrew Jackson's reaction to this. I find it to be just I don't know. So it is just so him to do it this way. So anyway, you have this mentally unbalanced guy. His name is Richard Lawrence, and Richard Lawrence was cuckoo. I mean, he believed he was actually King Richard III of England, and that President Jackson was part of an international conspiracy to keep him from getting his inheritance and getting his throne. I mean, the guy is absolutely bonkers. And so he decided that he must, in order to inherit his throne and become who he is supposed to be, he must assassinate Jackson. And so he actually has 2 pistols. And Jackson was attending the funeral of, what's his name? Representative Warren Davis of South Carolina. And while at the funeral, he tried to get close enough to Jackson to use one of his pistols on him, but was unable to do so. So he decided to hide behind a pillar, kind of in the building where this was being held. There were these big pillars outside. And so as the crowd is leaving, he's standing behind the pillar. And when he sees Jackson walk by, he steps out and points a gun point blank at Jackson and pulls the trigger, and the pistol misfires. And so it doesn't kill Jackson. And then he pulls his other pistol up and tries to shoot that one at Jackson too, and that one misfires. Now, you would think if you were president and someone was trying to shoot you, with a gun at point blank range, what would your reaction be? Like anybody, what would a normal human reaction be for a person?
I'd be freaked out.
Yeah, you'd
I'd run.
You try to duck, you try to get behind something. Zach, did you have anything you wanted to add? Like what would a person?
That is what I would do. I would just be like, and start running away.
Yeah, you try to get out of there,
Yeah.
right? Not Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson gets enraged and he pulls his cane out. Okay, well, he has a cane with him, and he basically just runs at the guy and he starts beating him savagely with his cane. So in this assassination attempt on a president, they have to pull the president off the assassin. And basically, there were a bunch of people who like tackled Lawrence, but then like as they were tackling Lawrence, Andrew Jackson was like beating Lawrence with his cane, and so they had to like pull the president off of him. Davy Crockett was actually one of the people that was there that tackled Lawrence to the ground. And of course, he landed some pretty good shots on Lawrence before they pulled him off. But Lawrence obviously was bonkers, and so they later found him innocent by reason of insanity, and he spent the rest of his life in an asylum. But yeah, that was that was the assassination attempt on Andrew Jackson. And I just love his reaction. Yeah, go ahead, Chase.
Do you think people were like supportive of him? They were like, "Yeah, our president fought off an assassination attempt." Like, do you think that got popular around America?
All right, let me just ask you in return. Like, let's say there's an assassination attempt on Trump, and Trump like gets angry, and he just like goes out and just like they're like people are like grabbing the person. They're like he's like got a gun, and they're like trying to wrestle him down, and Trump just goes up and punches him right in the nose. What do you think the reaction would be in America to that?
Shock.
I mean, the Republicans are gonna like it.
It would probably be a meme, honestly.
Oh yeah, people would be love. Yeah, people would.
I would say just shock from that just happening.
That'd
Because
be
like
beautiful.
because like no one would be expecting it from him.
Yeah.
So it would be like just crazy.
I mean, but yeah, wouldn't that just like feed into the whole, rah image? Kenzie, what were you gonna say?
Okay, so if this scenario did happen, I bet you that guy would feel so bad. He'd be like, I went to shoot him, and he punched me in the face.
I just love it because this is Andrew Jackson to a T. Like Andrew Jackson, and it is funny how many parallels there are between him and Trump. I mean, Trump's not like I would say as rough and tough, so to speak, not getting in bar fights all the time, but they're both these kind of disruptor figures, But It just like Andrew Jackson just cracks me up. I mean, in a lot of ways. Faith, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something else?
Weren't asylums back then like really, really, really bad?
Oh yeah,
Like they basically tortured you in a
yeah.
way because they didn't really understand mental illness. So
We're
like
gonna
what they just had really, really cruel methods and people there. Like you would have preferred the death penalty instead of going to an asylum.
Yeah, actually, you're anticipating something we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a reformer by the name of Dorothea Dix, who is actually the one who gets the first mental hospitals put together, and then later there will be a muckraker journalist, an investigative journalist named Nellie Bly, who will talk about like how bad the conditions are in some of the asylums in New York. She gets herself committed to to like do an undercover investigation and exposes. So then there's all this reform. So yes, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that they did not understand mental illness very well.
Yeah,
didn't understand
that wasn't a good thing at all.
right, like electroshock therapy, like actually was thought to be a good thing for a while. Like you know,
Like really, like ice baths, weren't that a thing? Like they would dunk you repeatedly in ice baths or something.
yes, and that was actually something that Nellie Bly actually had happened to her. Yeah. So again, you know, some of it is born out of ignorance, and some of it is just, you know, cruelty on the part of the people who were there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but excellent question. And Ethan, what were you going to say?
I'm just kind of baffled by how lucky Andrew Jackson was,
I know,
and
because
that both pistols misfired.
I know.
That, like, even though, yeah, like, flintlocks are pretty unreliable, but both pistols misfiring, like, not even getting injured or something like that.
Apparently, Mr. Lawrence was much better at planning things than he was at executing them. He probably that probably is partially.
Should have kept a third gun on him.
Yeah, but like, yeah, to have one gun misfire and then have another. Now, if it was a much more reliable gun, like we were just talking about with the revolver, it probably would have been a different story. But yeah.
I think the case with the revolver, weren't the first cartridges paper cartridges? They were like a wax paper lining that were just pre-powdered, and they had like you had to make the bullets yourself, I think.
Yeah, like you had to you had to put it together yourself. Like you poured the gunpowder in ahead of time and then you put it together.
Yeah,
But
I think I've seen this like fancy device that like you measure it in grains and then you like turn it into a puck to put into a bullet.
right, and actually, there are bullet making machines like that now, where you create the casing and you basically like you pour the gunpowder in and then you put the bullet. Like I've seen people use those. So yeah, that's definitely something that's around still. Faith, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to add to the fact of like when the revolver first came around and people had to make their own ammunition. I feel like that would be very, very dangerous because like I know today people do make their own ammunition, but you have to be very, very careful because if you don't pack the powder properly, can it explode in the gun and hurt the person who's firing it?
And it can wreck your gun too, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you have to be very precise. But then again, like sometimes, you know, people who do it are more precise than the gun manufacturers. But like nowadays we have all, you know, the robots do it basically, and so it's all very, very
Yeah, but like you said, a lot of people do make their own bullets because in the long run it can save a lot of money. Like you can reuse the old brass casing and everything like that.
right.
But yeah, you have to be very, very careful when you do that because if you don't do it pretty much exactly right, then there's a chance of misfire or like an explosion in the gun.
Yeah.
Like it can really hurt you.
Yeah, and not only that, it can ruin the gun too, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't hurt you, it can still ruin the gun. And then Dylan, what were you going to add?
Just in about Faith's statement, Samuel Colt developed after he put out the patents for the gun, he developed a bevel on the barrel that prevented double misfires, or not misfires, like a round that wasn't chambered firing off.
A double chambering of the round, right, is what you're talking about.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So yeah, what we seem to have some people who are very familiar with gun history here. Yes, excellent addition there. And then Ethan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think sometimes like a common mistake was that some people like straight up put black powder over the bullet again when making the bullet.
Right.
So like that basically caused the gun to explode. And
Right.
remember, it is black powder, so I think the first Colt Pattersons had a problem with like the cylinder would get very clogged because of black powder detritus.
Right. The more
That's why it's really important to clean your gun.
Yep. All right. Well, let's continue. But yeah, that was excellent discussion of that. It looks like Tristan isn't here, so I'll talk to him about getting a different slide. But you all remember that in the Missouri Compromise, the area south of Missouri was they allowed people to have slaves there. If a and they called it Arkansas Territory. So Arkansas really is kind of going to come from people moving into this territory, setting up plantations, owning slaves, and kind of trying to set themselves up as the new, planter class glitterati of Arkansas. And Arkansas had Europeans in it for a long time. I mean, the first people who explored it were Hernando de Soto, who we talked about, and there was actually a French explorer named Henry de Tonty who had gone out to meet René de la Salle in 1686. But when he couldn't find him, he set up a trading settlement at the mouth of the Arkansas River known as Arkansas Post. And that's really kind of where the name comes from. And actually, it's a French mispronunciation of an Illinois word for quapaw. So he thought he was giving a correct reference to the Quapaw tribe, which it means the downriver people. But anyway, it reaches the 60,000 person threshold, writes a state constitution, and comes into the Union as the 25th state and as a slave state. And of course, when we talk about a slave state coming in, we have to talk about a free state. And one of the last areas of the Northwest Territory from the days of the Articles of Confederation is Michigan. And Michigan basically is a territory that actually we lost during the War of 1812. In the War of 1812, British forces actually took Michigan territory from us for a while, but then in the Treaty of Ghent, we got it back. And there was a border commission that later would grant the Upper Peninsula area to the United States. And it becomes much more important when the Erie Canal is open. So when you're able to go from the Atlantic Ocean, up the Hudson River, across to Lake Erie, and then into the Great Lakes and basically get to all points, west in the Great Lakes, Chicago, etc. That's when Michigan really starts to see its population grow. And it surpasses the 60,000 person threshold. Really, by the 1830s, it had far surpassed it. And they write their state constitution and they come into the Union. But here's kind of an interesting little story. They get into a war with another state over like a 12-mile strip called the Toledo Strip. So Michigan and Ohio get into a war with each other over this. So if you've ever wondered, do states fight wars with each other? Actually, it did happen. It was known as the Toledo War. And the federal government had to step in. And essentially what they said is this: okay, look, we're looking for a place to give this new territory that we had gotten from Canada in this border, the settlement of a border dispute. So here's what we're going to say. Michigan, if you're willing to give up the Toledo Strip to Ohio and let them have it, we will give you this Upper Peninsula area. And so that is how Michigan ends up getting the Upper Peninsula. And of course, they're going to come into the Union as the 26th state and as a free state to keep the balance in the Senate between free and slave states. All right. So someone alluded to this. I believe it was Dylan who alluded to this earlier. There is a region in the new country of Mexico called the Tejas region. And the Tejas region had a lot of Americans who had basically moved across the border and were living in Mexico. So they had basically kind of become citizens of Mexico. But they've retained much of their American culture and spirit. And so Stephen Austin had brought 300 American families into a sparsely populated area known as the Tejas region. And of course, these were people who were looking to kind of continue the economic system that had made so many people wealthy in the South, which was slavery, setting up plantations, importing slaves, etc. But when Mexico got its independence from Spain, one of the things they did was they abolished slavery. So, you know how we talk about, Texas and the Alamo and all of that. Well, anybody want to guess what is the original reason why the people of the Tejas region basically revolt against Mexico? Ethan, what were you going to say?
They aren't allowed to keep slaves,
Yeah,
even though
they're fighting.
that's the whole reason why they came there.
Right. So they're fighting to keep this system of slavery, which had been banned by Mexico. So when you look at that, you're like, oh, okay. now suddenly the Tejas thing and the Alamo and all of that kind of, it doesn't sound as glorious and as patriotic as it once did. Yeah, Chase, what were you going to say?
Wouldn't people lose some of their rights if they moved to Mexico? Because
Yeah. Go ahead.
They had a bunch of free rights in America, and when it went over to Mexico, they would just lose some of those to not have slavery.
Right, but slavery was a bridge too far for them. They might be like, well, okay, yeah, if you don't, I don't have my, First Amendment freedom of speech, protections like I used to or whatever. But, if you try to take slavery away from me, that's a bridge too far, Zach, what were you going to say? Zach?
I'm not any expert on this in any means, but I thought I was doing some reading, and when Santa Anna became the leader, they had like a federation system, and that when he became leader, he abolished the federation system they had. So like it was partially slavery, but also like he completely changed the government, and now Texas was under direct rule of him rather than their own federation.
Right, and I'm actually just about to get to that. It's like where the American settlers are refusing to listen to the government, the central government in Mexico and in Mexico City, and so what? And I mean, you can definitely make a case for Santa Anna being a bad guy in a lot of ways. But yeah, Santa Anna basically consolidates central control of Mexico by abolishing their federal system, and so when he comes into power, this really causes the Americans living in the Tejas region to feel like their rights to, especially slavery, are going to be abolished. Nick, what were you going to say?
I was going to ask, since slavery had been or as reformed or abolished in Mexico, was there anyone religious or possibly just slaves that migrated toward Mexico just for that sole purpose, or did it just not really have an impact overall and it was just kind of a local thing?
Are you saying are there slaves who would go to Spanish territory?
Did they try to flee to Spanish territory?
Yes, that was actually true in Florida as well, which is where we get the whole Seminole tribe from. Here's the only problem with fleeing to a Spanish-controlled territory if you are Black, and that is you are on the absolute lowest level of the social hierarchy. So remember, if you were mixed race, if you were mestizo or mulatto, you had some rights, but if you were full-blood Native American, full-blood African, that obviously, would mean that you would have very few rights. So you could move to that region. The problem was once you were there, you wouldn't have very many rights unless you were living in kind of a wild, area where you could make your own rules, like the Seminole did in kind of the swampy areas of Florida where, people just didn't want to go and try and control them. And so, yeah, so there is some motivation, but you'll see that once we get to kind of, the Underground Railroads, like extensive, where do things go? Because actually, when we covered the Underground Railroad, there were lines on the map going south towards and west towards Spanish-controlled territories. There just aren't as many, because the further north you go into those kind of really heavily Christianized areas, the more equality there was for freed slaves, the more they could, live their lives the way they wanted to. So that's actually an excellent question. And that takes us to a very, I guess you could say, overly legendarized event in American history where we've basically kind of, let the legend and the glory of, the last stand of certain individuals overshadow kind of the real story. And that is the story of the Alamo. So, like Zach was saying, Santa Anna basically it tightens his grip down and consolidates his control over the Tejas region. And part of that was abolishing the federal system. But then when the Tejas region still continued to resist and continued to maintain its slavery and its way of life, he decided to send troops north to put down this quote unquote rebellion. And really what he was trying to do is get control of all of the weaponry, the cannons, the guns, etc. And so um, there were a bunch of cannons in the town of Gonzales, which was east of San Antonio. And the the primary motivation of the Mexican military was to get those cannons before the American settlers could get their hands on them. So when the Texas settlers just basically break out into outright rebellion against the Mexican forces, they win some initial battles. So Santa Anna came north himself with a very sizable force from Mexico City. And in one of the areas where the American settlers were rebelling, he had a huge numerical advantage. And this was near a fort called the Alamo. So he surrounded the rebels at the Alamo, who had actually sent word to Sam Houston, who was kind of the guy who was organizing the Tejas region rebels to kind of form a big enough army to actually fight off the army from Mexico City that was coming at them. And Sam Houston was like, okay, I have two choices. And this has been controversial ever since. I can either get my army to the size that I need to get it to in order to actually face Santa Anna and win, or I can go save the lives of these guys at the Alamo, but we'll probably end up overall losing a lot of our men, and we might end up losing the war overall if we save their lives. And so, and these kind of decisions have to be made all the time in wars. He decides that for the quote, the greater good, he is going to have to not go and defend the defenders of the Alamo, which did include some famous people, Davy Crockett being the most famous. But then there are Jim Bowie, who was sick with a fever at the time, and the Bowie knife is named for him, and William Travis, who were there. So the defenders actually did hold out for about 2 weeks before the Mexican army stormed the fort and killed pretty much 180 defenders, but lost 600 men in the process. And of course, we've made movies about this. There's been books that have been written about the kind of the great last stand of Davy Crockett, who was already a folk hero in a lot of ways. And let me find this really quick. This is the scene where Davy Crockett, meets his doom. And I'm trying to remember the name of this actor. Billy Bob Thornton. That just came to me. Okay. So Billy Bob Thornton is basically playing Davy Crockett. And here he is in his glorious last stand, and of course there's all this fighting and whatnot. And here he is as as the Mexican soldiers come for him. All right, now that is actually probably false. Most likely, because when you look back at the primary sources, especially the ones where you have Mexican soldiers telling people their accounts of what happened, and also an account from Sam Houston, there were about 7 people who surrendered. at the end, and Davy Crockett was most likely among those, if you believe the Mexican sources. And they had actually negotiated their surrender with one of Santa Anna's sub-commanders, who is like Castillon or something like that. I forget exactly the guy's name, but then Castillon basically was like, hey, we've negotiated a surrender with these guys. And Santa Anna looked really irritated when he heard that, and he's like, no. And he's like, they all die. And then like a bunch of his officers refused to kill them because, Davy Crockett had this reputation or whatever. And then some of his officers were like, yeah, let's do it. And they went in and basically used bayonets and just stabbed them all and killed them. So that was like a very inglorious end for Davy Crockett, kind of like, surrendering and then begging for his life, and then, and then eventually being killed. But anyway, regardless of how he dies, he does die. There was a woman, her baby, and a slave who were exempted from the mass execution. But other than that, that is the end of the Alamo. But it becomes a rallying cry. And so, Zach, go ahead. What was your question?
All right. So, wasn't there a battle? And there was I don't remember if he was like a general or something. And the city Houston was named after him.
Sam Houston. We're getting to it. I have a slide on it. So
yeah, I had heard. Oh, we do. Oh, okay. Yeah. I just remember hearing about.
Right.
There was a guy that killed the guy that beat Santa Anna that got Houston named after.
Yeah, and I was just talking about him. I was just saying Sam Houston was gathering this big army, and he had a chance to save Davy Crockett and the guys in the Alamo. But if he had come, he wouldn't have had enough of a force to beat Santa Anna, and probably would have lost, and that could have like jeopardized the entire revolt. So he had to wait until his forces got large enough. So, Nick, what were you going to say?
I remember like something from a long time ago about Santa Anna like exaggerating the numbers of the Alamo for like glory or something. Is that true?
Santa Anna is a notoriously unreliable primary source. So when historians go and look at primary sources and they check Santa Anna's accounts against the accounts of, like, say, for instance, individual soldiers who were a part, or officers who were a part of his forces, oftentimes they will find that Santa Anna lied. I mean, Santa Anna is not, even in Mexican history itself, he is not considered, a very heroic figure in any sense. But he tries to, inflate numbers on a regular basis. So yes, that is very accurate. Ethan, what were you going to say?
So I'm guessing that the federal government wouldn't really take it nice to, the killing of a, senator in this case, because wasn't Davy Crockett a senator, or
No,
was it previous?
He was a congressman, but he lost.
Okay, potential. But he was kind of, popular among the federal government.
Well, he's just popular with the American people, which is why Castillon, the one of the officers under Santa Anna, was willing to negotiate a surrender for him, and possibly, he could then be, ransomed back or something, or whatnot, to the United States. But Davy Crockett at this point is an ex-congressman, because he had stood up against the Jackson machine, and of course the Jackson machine made sure that he lost his re-election bid as a result.
What was Andrew Jackson's sort of view toward this event?
Andrew Jackson wants Texas to become part of the United States. So
he just kind of takes this as like, hey, they did this thing, let's go to war.
No, because he is going to be the person who actually makes the decision. But there is going to be a huge debate in the United States over whether or not we have the right to interfere in Mexico's affairs and to go in and support these Americans who are rebelling. And
I'm guessing it.
Well, go ahead.
I'm guessing it comes down to how they're mostly came from America, and even though they're technically not Americans because they're technically in Mexico.
Okay. Well, I mean, just to make a long story short, because we are going to get into this later, it has to do with, like, should the United States be expansionist, or should we just say, hey, we don't have a right to take territory away from others because we were originally colonies ourselves, and we don't want to do that to other
I
people.
guess Indians doesn't count though.
Right, but Native Americans, of course, doesn't count. Yeah, but I mean, but the people who were taking territory from them felt like it was justified to a certain extent because there's a huge amount of territory west of the Mississippi, and they're saying, well, there's
Would-
lots of land out there, so go ahead and just live in that area, and you'll be fine. But then, so
Would-
this is the whole manifest destiny debate. Like,
Oh yeah, so this would later reinforce the whole manifest destiny and kind of push up efforts to increase it.
yeah, so we're going to get to this, but essentially, there are some people who believe that we should dominate the entire continent of North America. And then there are some people who believe that that is imperialist and wrong, and it goes against our founding principles of, people.
I'm guessing we compromised with that, so yeah, just the whole coast to coast thing, like from the beginning.
Right. So when we do end up going to war with Mexico, we could have taken all of Mexico over, but we didn't. And again, so I mean, you're asking awesome questions. These are like, you're asking kind of the things that are coming down the road. But I'm giving you kind of the short capsule summary right now because we'll definitely be getting into this as we get further in. But you're anticipating what's coming. And Autumn, what were you going to say?
So, was the reason that this became such a big folk story, was that because of the Texans fighting for independence and the American spirit that came with that, or were there any other big impacts that came from it?
Right. Like if we hadn't absorbed Texas, like Texas will actually become an independent country for a little while. They will get their freedom from Mexico on their own without our help. But if we hadn't absorbed Texas later, this would have been two Mexican states fighting against each other. But because we absorbed Texas and the Texas story becomes part of the American story, yes, this gets romanticized. So excellent question. But yeah, this is one of those instances in history that you really have to look past the legend and really look at the primary sources to get the real story. Because yes, it does get overblown. All right, so and this is anticipating what Josh was asking. So I didn't want to get too far into it, but there he is. There's the picture of him right there. There is Sam Houston, kind of the guy who ends up being the great leader that will get Texas its independence as the Lone Star Republic. But another Mexican general, Jose Urrea, marches on a Texan forces near Goliad and actually forces the 342 defenders of that fort to surrender. But Santa Anna, once again, in his, kind of very bloodthirsty, ugly way of doing things, orders his men to execute all of the prisoners. And so those two atrocities, which actually Goliad is far more people dying, but really Alamo keeps getting remembered because of the fact that there were some famous people who died. That galvanizes all of the settlers of Texas to put aside their disputes and their petty differences and to unite under Sam Houston, which is what Sam Houston had been trying to get them to do all the way up to this point. Houston, being a very capable military mind in his own right, then surprises Santa Anna's forces in 1836 at the Battle of San Jacinto. So, Zach, this is what you were remembering right here. And in retaliation for Santa Anna's cruelty, many of the Mexican soldiers were executed. Santa Anna himself was captured in this battle and was going to be executed. Sam Houston basically said, okay, execute him. And Santa Anna was only able to avoid execution by agreeing as the president of Mexico, since he is by this point the actual leader of the country, to sign a treaty called the treaties of Velasco, which recognize Texan independence and that sets the border of Texas at the Rio Grande River. Now, of course, once he gets his freedom, once he gets free of the control of the Texan army under Sam Houston, he repudiates those treaties and he's going to go and get a larger force. But when he goes back home, there's some politics in Mexico City that basically kind of end up causing him to lose control. And people are very, very angry with him. He's not popular in Mexico City. So Texas gets its independence by basically, getting control of him, forcing him to sign this treaty or he's going to get killed. And then later when he repudiates it and, he's planning to come back with a bigger army, it never really happens because of politics down in Mexico. Zach, what were you going to say?
Did the citizens of Mexico have any interest in helping him win this, or was this just Santa Anna going in and doing it because he could?
They are unhappy with the fact that he signed these treaties and that his like unwillingness to bend a little for the settlers in the Tejas region caused this war in the first place. They basically blame him for the whole thing. They're like, you screwed this up. Like, we had a very profitable region that was like part of our country and could have been a very profitable part of our country. But because you had to be so inflexible, they revolted. And then you go up there and try to put down the revolt and end up getting captured and signing a stupid treaty. And so essentially, I mean, I'm making a long story short, but essentially that's, what happens. And he ends up losing his control, and I'm trying to remember exactly what happens to him, but it's escaping my memory right now. But anyway, that's basically, so Texas is kind of in this limbo state. So they're independent technically, but Mexico's not going to let them stay that way. So to answer your question, the people of Mexico do not intend for part of their country to get away and to break away and stay independent. They are going to reabsorb it. It's just a matter of time before Texas gets reabsorbed. So Texas knows this. Sam Houston and the American settlers who were there, who won their independence, they know this. So what do you think they're going to do in order to protect themselves? Like, what's the logical thing for them to do if they don't want to face another massive Mexican army? Because like, they beat Santa Anna by basically being tactically brilliant, but they're going to get overwhelmed just like the Alamo got overwhelmed. Ethan, go ahead, what were you going to say?
Ask the U.S. for support.
Yeah, so they're going to try to become part of the United States. That's going to be their way out, so to speak, because they're in a situation, and Zach, were you going to say something else?
All I was saying is I have the Mexican-American War, so I'm trying not to have y'all spoil too much of what I have ready to go later.
Okay, yes. All right, so I will try not to say too much there. All right, so Texas does become an independent country called the Lone Star Republic. But remember, this is not something where, they won their independence and no matter what Mexico did, they would never be able to get them back. No, that's not the case. Like, Mexico is intending to come back and stomp this region into submission. It's just a matter of time because of all the politics going on down in Mexico City with the kind of the mess that Santa Anna made out of things and how unpopular he becomes as a result. All right, so back to kind of what's happening in the US. The land speculation bubble that had been created when Andrew Jackson destroyed the Second Bank of the United States, put federal funds into pet banks for a little while, and those pet banks had basically been issuing their own paper currency and had been just giving out loans like crazy to speculators. That basically was causing another land speculation bubble. Okay, so anywhere where there was going to be a canal or a railroad, the land would go up in value dramatically. And so people would buy land while it was cheap, wait until it went up in value, and then sell it and make like, enormous profits. Some of the profits they made would set them up for life. So there's all these people who are kind of gambling, and hoping to strike it rich. All of the sales of public lands that were actually happening as people were moving west had brought in enough money for the US government to pay off the national debt. But a lot of the money that was coming in was paper money issued by state banks. So, because people were actually, deciding, I'd rather pay my debts off in paper money and hold on to my gold and silver. And so President Jackson became concerned that the U.S. Treasury had a lot of very unstable state bank owned currency or state bank issued currency in it. So he issued a little directive to the Treasury called the Specie Circular, which ordered the US Treasury and land offices to only accept payment for land in gold or silver. What do you think that's going to do to this big speculation bubble? Anybody? Yes, Ethan.
It's gonna pop the bubble just like the Panic of 1819, which is the very thing he blamed on the banks.
Boom. Yes, exactly. So that basically is kind of going to doom his successor. And Jackson basically decided not to run again in the campaign of 1836, but he actually basically tried to boost his popularity into Martin Van Buren. Okay, and this is where the guy who had killed Tecumseh, this is where he runs. So that's Richard M. Johnson, the vice presidential candidate there, and he was famous for killing Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames River in Canada. But he also was very controversial because he had an African American wife, and then that rankled some Southerners. But they wanted to add some kind of Western frontiersman chutzpah to the ticket. So because Martin Van Buren is this little kind of manipulative Northerner who is much better at playing politics than he is at being kind of a Jackson-like figure. So the Jackson grassroots political machine goes all in for Van Buren. And there was now another party. The Anti-Masonic Party and the National Republicans joined forces and formed the Whig Party. Okay, so this is named for one of the old factions in England when we talked about the Tories and the Whigs. And they decided that they were going to try to make it so nobody gets over 50% in the Electoral College, because you guys may remember this from the election of 1824. If nobody gets over 50%, who ends up deciding the presidency?
House of Representatives.
House of Representatives. Again, we could see that happen in this election coming up. If we have electors who refuse to vote, one way or another because of how contentious this is. So anyway, they basically are so disunited that they end up kind of nominating 3 candidates, one in each region, hoping that each of the 3 candidates would pull enough electoral votes away, that Martin Van Buren would not be able to get over 50%, and then they could throw it to the House, where they had a better chance of actually rigging it in favor of a Whig. And so you have William Henry Harrison, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, who runs in the West. You have Hugh White, a Southern planter who runs in the South. And you have Daniel Webster, that great orator and senator and ally of Henry Clay, who runs in the North. And so they were hoping to kind of repeat what happened in 1824 and make it so nobody gets over 50%, because they felt like in the House they had a much better chance of actually rigging it in their favor. So this leads to a very interesting election in 1836. Notice how the popular vote is pretty splintered here. And you've got once again, you've got the South Carolina has its own little nullifier party, the Independent Anti-Jackson Party, as it was now called. So their 11 electoral votes go to a guy named William Magnum, and really, honestly, it's just a way for them to kind of thumb their nose at everybody and say, we hate you all, so to speak. Hugh White is able to take the southern state of Georgia and the southern state of Tennessee, but it's not enough to counterbalance all the other southern states that end up going for Van Buren. William Henry Harrison takes Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, and he ends up taking some states over in the Northwest, kind of in like the middle states as well, like Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey, and Vermont. but he does take a New England state, but Daniel Webster is the most disappointing of all of the candidates because he only ends up taking Massachusetts. And because the Whig vote is split, it does enable the Democratic Republicans to kind of run the table. And again, a lot of it goes down to grassroots organizing. A lot of it goes down to those people who want public office, you know, as a reward for helping bring their state into the Jackson Coalition. And so the very heavy electoral vote states of New York and Pennsylvania end up going to Van Buren, which basically enables him to clinch election in 1836 and become our 8th president. So Martin Van Buren is he is just this incredible character. He's in a lot of ways the total opposite of Jackson. Jackson was this rough and ready disruptor figure, kind of like just a frontiersman in a lot of ways. Van Buren is this very, kind of he very carefully chooses his words. He's and he shifts his positions based on what's popular. So he's basically a political operator, okay? And that's how he had wormed his way into Jackson's favor, was by being a political operator. But now that he was in charge, there's nobody above him for him to please. He's now in charge. And so he actually kind of had all these nicknames. People had kind of, seen him for, the little manipulator that he was. They called him the Red Fox of Kinderhook, or the Little Magician. But a lot of people just didn't like him. And so he basically had to kind of try to ride Jackson's coattails. But what we talked about in the Specie Circular is going to affect his entire presidency, because as Van Buren is boasting of the nation's prosperity, he's bragging on the economy. Again, the parallels today are pretty strong, where Trump was bragging on the economy. He was hoping that the economy going strong and the political machine that had kind of been set up would be enough to get him reelected. But almost immediately, as soon as he comes into office, there is another bigger financial panic than the panic of 1819. And so, like we mentioned, there was a speculation bubble in the market that was created by land speculation, cheap land prices, easy credit from state banks, many of which had been flush with capital for a while, when they were pet banks under Jackson before the independent treasury is created. And so Jackson, when he issues his Specie Circular and says, if you're going to buy land from the feds, you have to use gold and silver, that's enough to slow down the demand for land. And so when demand goes down, so do prices. And so that pops the bubble. And essentially there is this mass sell-off as people start to see the value of their land go down. They're like, okay, it's time to sell. But when everybody's trying to sell at the same time, nobody wants to buy, and prices just drop like a rock. And the states now are starting to tighten up credit. They're not offering credit as easily, and that only continues to make it so there's less demand. And so all of this, it just has this massive kind of domino effect. Banks are hit really hard. Then banks are like, well, we're not going to give out new loans for railroad projects or for canals. And then you have mass unemployment as all of these businesses start to go bankrupt, and it just has this massive domino effect. And so the country is in misery, and you can see the pictures here, the political cartoons of families that don't know what they're going to do, and long lines of people kind of out in the street. Zach, what were you going to say?
So I think at this point, Jackson had already served 2 terms, right?
Yeah, and boy, is it a good thing he wasn't in for that.
Yeah. Does he ever have to pay for completely crashing the U.S. banking system, or does he just get away with it because nobody can hurt him?
People don't understand what is causing this. Okay, so this is a matter of like people not getting the fact that it is actually Jackson's fault. They don't know that. Most people feel like it's bankers in the Northeast that have screwed things up somehow. So there, we have the 2020 benefit of hindsight. You know, hindsight's 2020. We can look back and we can see what actually caused these things. But at the time, when people are in the middle of it, they don't know like what's causing it, and many of them blame the bankers. They're like, oh, those bankers and they're stupid, you know, they're the ones who did this, blah blah blah. So yeah, Jackson actually ends up maintaining his popularity in spite of basically causing this financial panic. But again, at some point the bubble would have popped, and the bigger the bubble gets, the more painful it is when it pops. So, but he caused the bubble when he killed the second bank of the United States and deposited the funds in the pet banks. But most people were blaming the bankers in the Northeast for it. So it's kind of funny how that works. Ethan, what were you going to say?
I'm guessing since Martin Van Buren wasn't exactly popular to start with, they kind of just blame him for this, even though he just got in.
Yes, and we were just about to talk about this. Like, here's one of the cardinal rules of American politics, which Trump, this, like, everybody thought that this was going to affect Trump too, but like their economy was recovering, you know, to the point where maybe not. But when you are in charge as president and the economy tanks, people blame you because they just want to blame somebody. And the president is the most visible guy in charge, even though he only executes the laws that Congress is passing. He doesn't make his own policies in a lot of ways.
So what would people decide that, you know, now that the pet banks don't work and that they're still blaming the bankers, what can you do, though?
Like, what do you mean? What can
they already got rid of the national bank and they thought that would solve the problem. It didn't. And then they made the pet banks, and then this happened. What are people going to do to change?
Oh, to change things? You can't take away there's like First Amendment freedoms and freedoms that you just can't take away from people. So like they could be mad at the rich, but they can't really like take their money away from them or do anything to them. Like, and the federal government at this point does not regulate business like it doesn't step in and regulate industries. That won't happen until like the
I guess in terms of a banking thing that people just kind of shrug their shoulders and just say it's bad.
Yeah. Essentially, you know, people are just like those jerk bankers, and you know, if I see them, I'll beat them up or kill them or whatever. But essentially, you know, it's like there's nothing we can do. Like,
does this ever bring back, you know, ideas of bringing back the, you know, federal bank?
Well, we won't end up having a national bank until right before World War I. And it's kind of funny. It is someone who is probably one of the greatest liberals in American history who will end up being the kind of the impetus behind creating that federal bank. Does anybody know what is the federal bank that we still have now?
Teddy Roosevelt?
It's not Teddy Roosevelt, actually. Does anybody know? But does anybody know what the name of that bank is? What is our central bank called? Because we see it in the news. Jerome Powell is the chairman of the board for this bank. It's the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve but that won't be created until right before World War I by Woodrow Wilson.
I'm guessing that was kind of inspired by the ideas of, you know, how the Jackson put those, you know, tiny Federal Reserves all around the place. So they thought, hey, why not just have one big one?
Well, the Federal Reserve, because there is this resistance still to a national bank, will have 12 different branches, and the 12 branches will all kind of work in tandem with each other to essentially create a national bank, since they all work together. But yeah, I mean, really, the impetus for it is there are all of these social programs that they want to pay for, but they're just not bringing in enough revenue. And so, and of course, Woodrow Wilson wants to involve us in a war. And that, of course, is going to be some impetus as well. You know, if we were going to get into war, you know.
At this time, didn't the federal government have to take loans from state banks since, you know, there wasn't a federal bank?
You're going to see what happens. Where there's also going to be a situation where the entire financial system is threatened with collapse because the value of the dollar is still based on whether or not we have a big enough pile of gold sitting in
And I'm guessing the problem is there's just not enough gold or silver to get.
Well, during the Panic of 1893, the people start trading in paper dollars for gold to such an extent that the value of there's like kind of like a confidence value. So like if as long as the federal government had $100 million worth of gold, this is in the 1890s, sitting in the treasury, then people would have confidence in the dollar. But
I'm guessing that would inspire the, Franklin D. Roosevelt's decision later in the Great Depression, to consolidate all the gold.
No, it's more complicated than that. But essentially, what's going to happen is there's going to be like only one person in the country who's rich enough to bail out the federal government, and that person is going to bail out the federal government. It's one of the great captains of industry, one of the great industrialists, and I won't spoil it, but I have a slide on it when we get there. And this person is literally going to buy $62 million worth of government bonds in gold, which is just, it's unbelievable that somebody would have, that much capital that they could basically bail out the federal treasury. But that's essentially what's going to happen. So anyway, that's the Panic of 1837. And that takes us to another.
Sorry, I got logged out.
Okay, I see you, Cody. I just admitted you. You're good. So that takes us to a really incredible case, which has been turned into a movie by Hollywood called Amistad. It's actually a Steven Spielberg, I believe, is the one who did the movie in the 90s, and it's really good. It's
a really good movie.
Yeah. And so this centers around a court case that has to do with a group of slaves that is brought by a Portuguese slave ship. Now remember, by this time, the international slave trade has been abolished by the British. And so this Portuguese slave ship had brought them across the Atlantic to the West Indies, and which is the Caribbean. And they had been bought by some American planters in the South. So these American planters were actually engaging illegally in the slave trade. And there was a Spanish ship that was bringing them from the Caribbean after they had been purchased to the coast of America. And while they were on this ship, one of the slaves, a African who goes by the name of Cinque, which means prince in the language that they spoke, Cinque is able to get his freedom and then free the other slaves, and they get their hands on some weapons and they take over the ship. And so the Amistad is basically, they've killed all the Spaniards on the ship except for two. And they basically, because they don't know how to navigate the ship. Yeah, go ahead, Olivia.
So is this kind of like a slave revolt?
It is. It's a slave revolt on a ship. And basically, then we get the name of this entire case from the name of this ship, the Amistad. And so these two Spaniards are told by Cinque, go back to Africa, take us home. Okay, so, and Cinque knew enough to know that they had come from the place where the sun rises, which was the east. So during the day, they would sail east. But at night, they were secretly basically they were turning the vessel around and heading west. So really what the ship was doing was it was zigzagging. It was going east for a while during the day, and then it was going west, and then it was going east, and then it was going west. And so they just keep actually kind of drifting further and further north. And eventually, they sight land, and the Africans on the ship are very excited. They're like, very happy that they now have land, and they feel like they've made it back home. And so they get into a boat and they go out to kind of, see where they are, so to speak. But really they're on they're off the coast of the eastern United States up near New England, and there should have been a clue. It's kind of misty and foggy and colder than Africa, so they're kind of like confused. And while the Cinque and some of the leaders are over on the shore, a U.S. Coast Guard ship comes up and basically takes possession of the Amistad and then captures Cinque and the others who are on a rowboat on their way back. And eventually, all of them are placed into custody. And the case goes to court in, I believe, in the city of Boston, in Boston, Massachusetts. And so, to the Southerners, this is a salvage case. This is somebody found property on the high seas, and it's a property case, and they want it decided that way. But to the Northerners, many of them, this is a case about freedom. It's a case about abolition. And so that is a very kind of influential abolitionist in the North named Lewis Tappan involved. Yes, Ethan.
Wouldn't the main confusion be over, like the Spanish ownership? Technically, the ship is Spanish, and like it's technically illegal to buy slaves in the U.S., and it's basically just a bunch of, bureaucratic sort of confusion.
Okay, so it's basically there are international treaties that recognize the rights of salvage on the high seas. And so the two Spaniards who actually survived this whole ordeal and are now in the United States, Senors Montez and I forget the other guy's name, but they basically claim that the slaves all belong to them because each slave is worth like, anywhere from hundreds to like over $1,000. So it's like a lot of money we're talking about. So they claim that this group of slaves, which are all in chains and are all basically, having their fate decided, they say, well, these people all belong to us. And so they're claiming salvage. There are some sailors in the U.S. Coast Guard who say, hey, we're the ones who found the ship, so these slaves belong to us, and they're claiming salvage. So that was what the case was originally about. But Lewis Tappan hires this lawyer, Roger Baldwin, and Roger Baldwin is representing the rights of the slaves themselves. And he actually comes in and defends this as a case, like you're saying, of it being illegal slave trading. Because the question is, nobody knows where these slaves are from. Like if they're from Africa, then that changes everything. It's not a case of salvage anymore. It's a case of, and
Yeah, I would be thinking that the confusion would be like technically the whole thing of them owning them wouldn't be the part. Is that could they sell them here? Or
yeah,
could they bring them here?
yeah. So Montez and this other guy, I forget whose name I forget, basically are, lying when they say that these slaves are actually from the American South. Because if they're from the American South, then it's property case. If they're from Africa, then it's like they should basically go back to Africa because you're not supposed to take people from Africa anymore. So Roger Baldwin ends up going out and looking for interpreters and finally finds a guy who speaks the same African language that Cinque does, which is Mende. And he then actually is able to talk to Cinque in his language and finds out that Cinque and all of these people are from Africa. And so what they end up doing is he ends up going and searching the ship and finding the ship's manifest. And in the ship's manifest is documentary evidence that these slaves were actually cargo off of the infamous Portuguese slave ship known as the Takora, which the British Navy had been trying to take out for a long time. And so he actually wins the case and and gets them their freedom at the district court level. But because Southerners, including John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, see this as a way for Northerners to push the idea that slavery is wrong and abolition is a legitimate cause, he puts pressure on President Martin Van Buren, who then basically sends in the Secretary of State to appeal this case. And of course, at this point, the Spanish government is involved as well, because this has now become an international case. And And so it goes all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And Roger Baldwin has done a great job of proving the case, but they need some extra big guns, so to speak, like a lawyer who can speak at the level of these, at the people at the Supreme Court, many of whom are older and are kind of part of that older genteel class. And what they end up doing is they end up convincing John Quincy Adams, former president of the United States, to come and argue on behalf of the Amistad slaves. And John Quincy Adams is very old at this time, but still has his mental vigor and makes an incredible closing argument, which again is in the movie Amistad. Again, I really highly recommend it if you hadn't seen it yet. But he actually makes such a brilliant argument that the Supreme Court, even though a lot of them were slaveholders, they argue in favor of the slaves and Baldwin and Adams, and the Amistad slaves are given their freedom and are sent back to Africa by the United States government. So, Ethan, what were you going to say?
In this case, did they ever crack down on the whole illegal Caribbean trade part of it, or was that still, hidden?
You know who's trying to do that because of the large naval presence they have in the Atlantic?
Who?
Anyway, you want to guess? Take a guess as to who is really trying to crack down on the illegal slave trade from Africa. It's the British. The British. So actually, they do bring a British ship captain in and have him testify. And that's in the case. And then later he actually ends up destroying some of the slave fortresses on the coast of Africa, which were used as places where the Takora was still able to get slaves from. So, so eventually they are able to stamp out the international slave trade because some of these slave ships that were illegally continuing the trade were eventually caught and destroyed. So, so that, that's all part of this story, and it's just an incredible story. So I really highly recommend that movie if you have not seen it yet. Nathan, go ahead. Is this your slide, Nathan? Is that what you're saying?
And this is my slide.
Okay, so I'm going to let you take it away, so go ahead.
So the Trail of Tears is really just a part of the Indian Removal Acts. It's just a specific of what happened to the Cherokee. So at the time, there was like the 5 main tribes which were trying to act white, I guess, to fit in with like the white Americans, so they wouldn't get treated unfairly.
What did they call themselves? The 5 what tribes?
They were called the 5 civilized tribes.
Right. So they called themselves the 5 civilized tribes because they had adopted white civilization. They had assimilated themselves into white society, hoping that they could hold on to their land. Go ahead.
Of course, this wouldn't happen though, as white settlers moved westward into Tennessee, Georgia, and other southern states like Florida. They would want the land that these native tribes were on, and eventually Andrew Jackson would sign the Indian Removal Acts, which has pushed them off that land.
But the Indian Removal Act said that they had how long to gather their possessions, sell their land, etc., and move west? They gave them how many years?
I think it varies, but I think it was mainly 2.
Well, but the deadline, the absolute last deadline is 8 years. So in 1838, the federal government is going to enforce the Indian Removal Act for any tribes that haven't removed themselves west. So that's why this is happening in Martin Van Buren's time in office. But go ahead, sorry.
So Andrew Jackson was signing the Removal Acts, and the Cherokee would be the ones who would try to appease the Supreme Court, because it was mainly Georgia which was trying to push them off their land. And the Supreme Court would basically rule that Georgia, since it's a state, didn't have the right to push native tribes off their land. That was the federal government's power.
Okay.
However, eventually Andrew Jackson would sign a treaty with certain parts of the Cherokee to make them move, and mainly by bribing them and some members of the opposite political party to get them to move. And so I think while it was mainly under Van Buren when the Trail of Tears actually happened, I think Andrew Jackson set it up to happen.
Okay, yes, and there's definitely, he's got some involvement here for sure. But go ahead.
And so Andrew Jackson would, of course, would finish his years, and then Van Buren would become president. And this is when the actual relocation was supposed to happen, but only around 2000 Cherokee actually went ahead and migrated. The rest remained. And so Van Buren would send soldiers down to be rounded up and basically force them to march to the native, the new territory they set aside for the Cherokee in Oklahoma. And so this would lead to thousands of these people being basically forced to march from Tennessee to Oklahoma, which is hundreds of miles of land, and many would die from malnourishment, not starvation, but like malnourishment, dysentery, and other.
Right. So they're like, get your stuff together, let's go. And it's kind of like late in the year, so it's a little on the cold side. And when they set up camp, they are not real good about sanitation. So like you said, dysentery and other diseases kind of spread in the camp. There's lots of little kids, women, children, etc. And they have to march about 1,200 miles. But, this is seen in a very, kind of, we have emotional lenses on when we see this, because we're looking at, the sadness of the Native Americans. And that is definitely part of this. But there are 2,000 people who are a part of this that are not Native American. Who are the 2,000 people who are a part of this exodus of people? Like it's about 20,000 people who make this rather long journey on foot for the most part. Zach, what were you going to say?
Isn't it slaves?
Yeah. So there are 2,000 African slaves who are on the Trail of Tears because they're owned by Native Americans, because they belong to certain members of the Cherokee tribe who had set up plantations, and then of course were unwilling to give up their property, the slaves, when they left, so they took their property with them.
And wasn't that mainly due to the fact that Native Americans tried doing plantations and slavery to fit in with like the white Americans?
Yes, and that was because they're part of the 5 civilized tribes. Yeah, and the 5 civilized tribes were like, if we just do everything that they do, and we own land, and we have our own language, and we do all these things, and we own slaves, then we will be part of a white society, and they won't get rid of us. But of course, white people were jealous, and they were like, these people aren't Americans. They shouldn't have a right to this land, and they wanted the land. And so, yeah. So, Zach, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I mean, who coined the term Trail of Tears? Because that definitely, from like a historical context, definitely, no.
Nathan, did you come across that? Because I remember reading it at one point, but it has slipped my mind. I do not remember who said it.
I never came across it. I just assumed a historian put that name on there.
Zach, I want to say, but I'm not sure because my memory is a little fuzzy on this. I want to say that it was a Native American who was writing about it later who gave it this term, but I am not sure who actually did that. But that is an excellent question, because really we have kind of romanticized this to a certain extent, but also it is a terrible tragedy. And about 4,000 Native Americans, many of them women and children who were, not what you would consider combatants or anything like that, died as a part of this, because it was a forced march. Faith, what were you going to say?
I was going to ask if the Native Americans treated their slaves better than the white people did. Like, do we have any sort of documents or accounts of that? Because I feel like they wouldn't, because they had been mistreated by whites, but I could be completely wrong about that.
I have done some reading. Now, I haven't done an extensive amount of reading of primary sources on this particular topic, but from the reading that I've done, which is mostly secondary sources, the Native Americans who owned slaves were pretty much the same as white people who owned slaves. Like, in other words, they treated them like, it's like there was almost no difference. Like, they adopted all the same practices. They treated them in exactly the same way. There wasn't this special affinity of like, hey, we're another minority that is mistreated by whites, so we're going to treat you better. We're going to be on the same side as you. No, they treated them the exact same way that white people did.
Okay.
Yeah. No. There may be a primary source which sheds some more more detailed light on that. But from what I remember, that was pretty much the case. Max, you were next.
Is there a reason why they set aside territory for them instead of just giving them the boot entirely and kicking them out of the whole country?
Well, the question is, where are you going to go? Like, are you just going to say all of these people must die? Like, I mean, what would your alternative scenario look like? What would you say?
I mean, if I was a crazy dude in the 1800s who wanted to kick a bunch of Native Americans out and didn't really care about their health, I'd probably just like push them into Canada if I wanted to keep that territory.
But does that create an international incident with the British?
Depends if the British notice.
And actually, what you are saying is, to a certain extent, we do have some of Oklahoma territory, but some of it belongs to the Spanish as well. I'm sorry, the Mexicans as well. So we are kind of kicking them into Mexican America. But then, of course, the Tejas region has rebelled, and the Tejas region claims some of that territory as belonging to them. And so, yeah, okay, but some of the territory does belong to us. So it's kind of like a little border region with Mexican American areas, which doesn't have a lot of great rich farmland. Like the land of the Great Plains is a much thinner topsoil, a lot of clay in it. So Oklahoma isn't considered like premium farmland area. There are some spots which have good farmland in them, but for the most part, like the areas that they're being kicked out of are very valuable because of the rich black topsoil that goes deep down, and there's all kinds of nutrients. And so if you wanted to grow crops, the crops would grow and you would make a ton of money off of them. So one of the reasons that Oklahoma territory is considered like kind of like we don't really like it anyway, is because of the topsoil in the area. So yeah, they're kind of being kicked to an area where it's not a real popular area that a lot of people want yet anyway. That'll change later, but yeah, does that answer your question, Max?
Yeah.
Okay. Autumn, what were you going to say?
About how the natives treated their slaves. Do you know if they treated them the same as white people treated their slaves because they actually thought African Americans were less than them, or because they were just trying to fit in with white people?
I know that we all see white people as these devils. Like we when we look back on slavery, and to a certain extent they deserve their reputation, but just remember that a lot of the motivation for what they did was economic. It was not like we want to push our superiority. Actually, the whole racial superiority aspect of things will come into play during the Jim Crow era, when African Americans are citizens. And now there's a question of, well, who gets, certain economic benefits and like a certain level of economic status. And whites don't want to be on the same level as their former slaves, which for a period of time, for about 12 years during Reconstruction, the federal government forced that on the South, and whites really didn't like being on the same level as their former slaves. So the whole the racism that we're talking about, where the virulent racism really comes into play at that time because of that motivation. But at this time in history, they just see these people as unfortunates who happen to be property rather than citizens, and are, essentially like, whatever it takes to control them, they'll do it. They'll just, if it takes instilling fear, if it takes using the whip, but it was all just about, I want your labor and I want you to shut up and do what I say, and not fight back. And so really that's what it's mostly about. But then later the racism gets added in during the Jim Crow era. So that's an excellent question, Autumn. As far as the Native Americans and their motivations, they were primarily economic. Plus they wanted to assimilate completely into American society so they wouldn't lose their lands. Ethan, what were you going to say?
Would the whole, moving the Cherokee to Oklahoma cause conflicts with the Great Plains tribes?
Again, the great tribes of the Great Plains, for the most part, are going to be either south of this area in Texas, like the Comanche, or north of this area, like the Sioux, and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. So it's kind of a middle area where there are some tribes, but the really powerful ones aren't involved. So,
So,
yeah, these guys, and basically these people are just kind of like told, yeah, go in there and fend for yourself, and you're kind of on your own.
so on addition to that, when later the whole Native American territories are, you know, written up in some states, do they kind of just mishmash a bunch of other tribe backgrounds kind of to random areas, or are they conscious of their backgrounds?
So each tribe actually gets its own area, in what will later become Oklahoma. And by the way, Oklahoma gets its name from the Native Americans that lived there. Okla meaning red, and Homa meaning man, red man's territory. So eventually, like the original vision was that the entire area would just be a giant Indian reservation, but the reservation system that we're familiar with wasn't created until the 1870s under, or actually it's 1869 under President Grant in his peace policy reservation system, which was a way to bribe Western tribes into not fighting in return for land and food, guaranteed land and food. So yeah, so it's kind of yes, they each get their own spot. So like they're not creating further conflict, but it's before the reservation system as we are currently familiar with it. And Nathan, what were you going to say?
It was about the so since racism wasn't like the inherent reason that black people were the majority of slaves, why wasn't there more like poor white people who were slaves? Because wouldn't it have been easier to like get poor white people to become slaves and go to Africa to get slaves?
Well, again, they are citizens. So like a Native American is not a citizen. Citizens have rights. Like the Bill of Rights and state constitutions often had bills of rights of their own. They basically say, you can't, do those sort of things. You can't just force somebody to work for you without, but I mean, there was an attempt, early on to bring people over, and kind of, the indentured servitude thing. But yeah, that's an excellent question, is why don't they just take advantage of poor white people in the area? And the answer is because they are citizens of the United States and have rights. They have constitutional rights. And so you can't just take them and turn them into slaves. But these other people who they're just considered foreigners, like they're considered the enemy, so to speak, or they're just foreigners from another place, and they're easy to tell they're foreigners because they're from Africa. They have no rights because they are not citizens. So therefore, you can do whatever you want to them because they don't have the same protections legally. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, since I know like at the same period of time, like Russia still had like a lot of like servitude. So I was wondering why that didn't develop in like the southern United States.
Well, and again, this is AP World, but like the word slave actually comes from the Slavic peoples of Central Asia. And so really for the longest time, like through a much of early world history, the hub of like commerce and trade, it was the Indian Ocean. That was where China and India and the Swahili coast of Africa were all trading things. And one of the things that was traded back at that time was slaves, but many of the slaves that were traded were white. And that was actually true in the Roman Empire as well, many of the slaves. So slaves captured from Central Asian Slavic tribes were pretty common back at that time, and many of them were white, and so that's actually where we get the word slave from. So if you're looking over thousands of years of human history, the vast majority of it didn't include black slaves. It included many white slaves, although there were people who were captured in the interior of Africa and brought to the Swahili coast and were entered into the slave trade as well. But the whole black people as slaves thing really doesn't emerge until the 1700s with the triangular trade, which develops across the Atlantic Ocean after the Age of Exploration. So, Nick, you kind of had your hand up, but then it disappeared. Did we answer your question?
I kind of answered my own question in my head, but I was going to ask if there was like just, because I'm assuming there was like under the table probably, or just like very hidden, if any at all, like white slavery in the Americas, but I don't know. It just
It like, because the European settlers that came over, they went through that immigration and naturalization process. So once you're naturalized, you become a citizen. You have the rights of a citizen. And again, the whole concept of citizen really goes back to the Roman Republic, because there was the same thing there. If you were a citizen, you could basically say, I want to be tried in front of a Roman court. And you had certain rights in that Roman court. But if you weren't a citizen, then that people would just do whatever they wanted to you and you had no rights. So, that same concept of citizenship is also a part of America, later on. Ethan, what were you going to say?
Yeah, wasn't the whole, basically, the underhand as well, it's technically not a slave if the dude's in massive debt. Wasn't that, kind of prevented and finalized? There was like an act against you couldn't imprison a person and put them in like under hard labor for under debt prisons.
That was the Ogden v. Saunders case, which basically, again, it goes state by state because each state was its own separate little country at first, and then
I was guessing that would finalize it sort of into the ground that wouldn't be a viable method in the Americas.
In Ogden v. Saunders, it was like the people who had the contracts who wanted their money, they wanted to throw these people in prison. And they're like, hey, Supreme Court, you keep saying that contracts are like that nobody can break contracts. Like, not even the federal government, not even state governments, contracts with way back with the king, like in the Dartmouth case, those are still valid. So our contracts are still valid and we can still throw people in debtor's prison, right? But there were a bunch of state laws that actually had basically kind of come up with this new concept of bankruptcy, where it was more humane and they were not, throwing people in prison for debt.
Oh, I just have a question. Would there be any issues where contracts violated certain rights in some cases?
That's kind of where the Supreme Court comes down on this, where the Supreme Court is like, look, we are going to make an exception. Contracts are pretty much inviolable, but in this one instance, we are going to say, yes, states can make bankruptcy laws, and they can make a different way of paying off debts other than,
That's all I had to say.
Yeah. So it's an excellent question. But anyway, Nathan, did you have anything else that you wanted to add? Did you have like a primary source quote or anything else?
I have a quote.
Okay, go ahead.
It's from one of the soldiers who took part in the Trail of Tears, and he said, the
what? Say it again.
Cherokee routes during the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears. I fought through the war between the states and have seen many men shot, but the Cherokee removal was one of the cruelest work I've ever done.
Yeah. And a lot of it just has with the absolute sadness and they just didn't want to leave. And so, and of course, it is, it's a forced march, and it's very cruel in many ways because they're forcing people who don't want to leave. Great job. We had a really good discussion on that. So that is the Trail of Tears. And I just want to say, don't underestimate what Nathan kind of said there is very true. Don't underestimate how terrible this was in many ways and how great of a violation it was of Native American rights. Just also be aware that there are those little caveats, like the fact that they did own slaves and that the slaves were on the Trail of Tears with them, that are also part of the history that we often forget. So you're kind of getting the college level version of things here, where you're seeing, the less romanticized version of history. All right. I was kind of hoping that somebody would pick this guy for their slide because he's such an interesting character, but nobody did. But this is the father of the vegetarian movement. I don't know if I have anybody who's a vegan in class, but if you happen to be a vegetarian, this is the guy right here who is kind of considered the father of the movement. And he is actually a very charismatic figure. He was a Presbyterian minister who had fiery sermons and really, was able to kind of move his congregation, named Sylvester Graham. And he actually adopted the views of a guy in England who had also been kind of pushing vegetarianism over there. And basically they said, eliminate everything in your diet except for vegetables. And so he actually develops this kind of bread that was coarser and kind of kept the bran from the wheat in the bread. And that made it more healthy. And so that was actually processed into the famous graham crackers. And I'm sure some of you have had graham crackers before. They're still available, but they're not near as healthy as they used to be. But that was, and he kind of lived this Spartan lifestyle with bland food, sleeping on a hard bed, taking cold baths, wearing loose-fitting clothes, and even things like as extreme as abstinence from sex and just going out and exercising all the time. And so if, like we have people who are CrossFitters, who are health nuts nowadays. This is the kind of the 1830s version of that. And the people who adopted his practices, kind of trying to improve their health, were known as the Grahamites. And but people like vilified him. They said, "Oh, this is a poet of bran and pumpkins," and he was actually very popular until his health began to fail in his 50s. So, because his whole thing was, if you do these practices, you will your health will stay strong. So then he started like going off and trying to use these various cures that were being sold by these people who claimed they could cure diseases but often couldn't. And so and there was an opium enema that killed him eventually. So because the medical profession was not very strictly regulated or scientifically based at this time. So that is the amazing life of Sylvester Graham and his decline and death eventually. Yeah, Faith, go ahead.
I was gonna say there was an image of like old cough syrup from the 1800s or something, and like it was full of meth, cocaine, opium, and like it was like get rid of a cough in one night. And honestly, I think that'd get rid of a lot more than a cough, but whatever.
Yeah.
It was intense. Like there was so many drugs in there.
Right. There is no FDA. There is no that isn't going to get created until like the early 20th century. And there isn't an understanding of how addictive certain drugs will be. Even the early, versions of Coca-Cola would have like trace amounts of very hard drugs in them. So, these apothecaries that were around were often, and people were snake oil salesmen. They sold things that they knew didn't cure, but they just said they did to make money. And Zach, what were you going to say?
So, an opium enema, is that just an overdose, or what is
Yeah, I mean, an enema gives like stuff to your bloodstream a lot more directly. And it's kind of more near your backside that they introduce that into your system. And so that was something that people experimented with back at this time. And obviously that much opium would overdose you. So yes, he died of an opium overdose via enema. Not a great way to go, but Ethan, what were you going to say?
Would it technically be sort of correct to say that basically this was a dude who basically was one of the first victims to die of a heroin injection?
I don't know about that. Because heroin is,
I know, slightly chemically different. Is meant to be.
Yeah, it's a much more refined version of opium, but opium was actually a big deal in Europe
Yeah,
And
I know, and it would cause a lot with the British and Chinese.
right. So the British were like giant drug lords selling opium grown in India to Chinese people who were addicted to it. And there were these opium dens, all over China in major cities. And then they were in European cities as well, often run by Chinese people.
Yeah, I think it's like China banned them, and then it's like, why aren't you buying our drugs? You
And they,
should buy our drugs. And then they declared a war, and then Hong Kong became a thing.
right. So that's all AP World, like that's all stuff, and it's actually AP Euro as well. But basically that's the opium wars. And
Yeah,
so
it's kind of weird that a graham cracker basically is like, yeah, this super healthy food. It's gonna help you keep,
well,
nice and healthy. Now people just like put it on sugar and with more sugar and cocoa
and you
nowadays.
look at the ingredients of graham crackers now, they're not near as healthy. Like
Yeah, I think now they use like a lot more brown sugar and cinnamon.
right. So yeah, so anyway, it is interesting. But yes, to answer your question about opium, it was mostly smoked rather than injected.
Yeah, no, it was like a hard black solid, I think, at the time.
Yeah. So, and it came from the poppy seed, and that's really where you get it from. And so, yeah. But anyway, that is Sylvester Graham, a very interesting story. All right, advances in farming. I know somebody has this one, and I'm forgetting who took it. What did I do? Oh, I forgot to put it down. Okay. Does anyone who is on here have advances in farming? Because I think I neglected to write the person's name on this list here. Yeah. Okay. Because I do remember somebody saying that they wanted advances in farming. Well, anyway, if you have it, say something. Otherwise, oh yes, Ethan, go ahead.
Oh, I just have a question to ask. If we were to like drop off in the X-Men, you said would we have to do all three of the questions or the last one?
Just the third question.
Just the third question.
You have credit for the first two, so if you want to stick around for that last one, you're welcome to. If you're not, if you're busy and you have stuff to do, feel free. Totally up to you guys. I'm just trying to, keep us on track because obviously I will not see you. And if they change it and I do see you, then we'll make up for it somehow. Yeah, Faith, go ahead.
I just wanted to double check. I heard we were going to be on this call for 3 hours. Is that true?
I was extending it a third hour, but again, you don't have to stay on for the third hour if you don't want to. Because the only day I will see you in class will be Monday. So this is one of the weeks where we were supposed to have 3 days in class. And so like in order to get through all the material, like before the quarter's over, we would have to. So I was just going to extend it this third optional, and I can just roll through stuff myself if people don't want to stick around. But if you want to stick around and you want to get credit, I have to move it over into homework. Like if because they're basically saying on Wednesday we have to just give you something to work on. So I'm basically moving this over into homework, which I think this would be preferable to going through like me giving you textbook homework. So
is that like that third question, is that still due by Wednesday or is it due by Monday?
I don't know. I can work with you guys on that if you want me to.
Because I can just send it into like Outlook, so any time would work for me.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Whatever you want to do. No pressure at all. Like this is entirely up to you guys. I'm just trying to get the material without having to resort to the textbook, because that's my other option if we don't get through it without, So, I mean, I don't know if you all would prefer me just say, hey, read this in the textbook. But I kind of think this would be a little bit better than that anyway, because you could like be doing something else and you could just stick your headphones in and listen to it. So, Zach, did you have a question?
So do we not have class on Friday with you?
Friday, I have been asked to be part of this panel of teachers who are going to be setting standards for U.S. history for the state of Tennessee. So I will not be there because of that on Friday. Yeah, so I had already planned on Friday. Friday was already in the works. So this is just to make up for Wednesday, which I did not.
I have a really important question asked about AP money. Wasn't the deadline November 10th, but since we're going remote for the upcoming week. How do we get that turned in?
Here's the thing. Okay, if you are taking the AP exam, the money, like, I think that, like, okay, my son is in the Williamson County schools, and they're requiring people to turn things in by the 10th. That's the last day that you can pay the fee. But from what Coach Godfrey told me, he would highly encourage you to pay the fee by that time. But if you don't, you can still be signed up for the exam. You just have to pay it. Like, he hasn't given me a firm deadline for like when you pay it, because what's going to happen is, and actually, to answer your question about
can we just like come in whenever we're free and like turn into the office,
or you can pay it through AP Classroom. So if you pay it through AP Classroom, then, like, I know some people have already done that. Then you're
I guess I can do that.
Yeah, you can do that. I think you can do it with a credit card or whatever. So, but if you want to just write a check to Hill High School, then just either drop it off or.
I didn't know about the AP Classroom thing. That's just why I wanted to ask. I didn't know I could pay through that.
Well, some school systems are entirely remote. So what's happening is they're going to give the test through the lockdown browser on the AP Classroom.
All right, thanks for telling me.
Yeah, no problem.
I thought that you had to like register everything by the 10th, but you could pay it a little bit later.
Right. So you do have to be signed up. So a lot of you signed up for AP Classroom, but for those that didn't, Mr. Godfrey gave me a list, and I emailed you separately, and I said, hey, sign up for AP Classroom, because if you don't, he cannot order your exam. Cody, what were you going to say?
It was about the third hour. If we stay the third hour, we don't have to do the textbook. Is that what you said?
No, the textbook was like my other option besides doing a third hour, which I felt like that would be like really unpopular. So I felt like if I just did a third hour and I just asked a question where you just basically have to write a paragraph, like you just listen to it and write a paragraph, that would be better than doing like the textbook version. I mean, unless you prefer doing textbook, like that's fine. I mean, I can do that. That's the more traditional way of doing things. I'm just trying to be more, friendly and adaptive here. Yeah, so if you would prefer not to, so this is not like going to be a normal thing. Like, we're not going to usually go this long, but since I just found out, like, we're not going to have class on Wednesday, this is a way to kind of get a little further, so we're not completely, unable to finish and massively backlogged later, or me having to just dump a bunch of, hey, do these chapters kind of thing on you. Yeah. And you don't have to stay. You can listen to it and do the question later if you want. And then Olivia, did you have a question?
Yeah, it was about the AP test. Do I need to register somewhere? Because I did want to take it, and I'm glad you told me I could pay through AP Classroom. I could do that, but I didn't get an email. So what does that mean?
That means when I originally asked you to sign up for AP Classroom, that you did it. Like, you were like, he has a list of people who signed up and who didn't, and he basically said, hey, these people didn't sign up, and so if you were taking the exam, I was like sending an email. So if you didn't get an email, that means you signed up for AP Classroom, and you can pay through AP Classroom if you want to, or you can just drop off a check to the school. He's not forcing you to drop a check off to the school by the 10th, because the school's just going to pay, like, it's just going to go into a big pile of money, and then the school's going to write the College Board a check, and they're just going to say, we have X number of kids taking AP exams, and that would be not just US, but it would be all the other different, exams that are being taken, and they would just say that comes out to X number of dollars. And they would just write a check for it. So they would your money would go in that account, and they don't have to pay that by the 10th. But different school districts do it different ways. So like my son has to pay it by the 10th, or we have to pay it for him by the 10th. But that's because Williamson County is like making people do that. Coach Godwin.
All right, Mr. Johnson, I'm gonna hop off a bit. I'll watch the rest of this through.
Cody, what was your question? Cody, you have your hand up. Did you want to say anything?
Oh, sorry, that was my bad. I forgot to put it down.
Okay, no problem. All right, so John Deere is this guy right here, and he was actually a blacksmith, and he got into debt in the East, so he moved out west to Illinois. And while he was in Illinois, he noticed that a lot of farmers had a hard time with this this more clay-rich soil, which is going to be very common in the Great Plains. And so he actually developed a technique that had been used for making steel needles to make polished steel plows, because iron plows would often crack and break under the pressure of trying to break up the ground. And so these plows revolutionized farming in the West, and that, of course, would make Deere rich. And his company, John Deere, is still around today. Cyrus McCormick took an invention that his father had been working on for years, for a horse-drawn mechanical reaper, where it just has these arms that like pop out to the sides, and the arms would kind of go on. They had these little belts that would go, and they would just pick the corn, like, or whatever crop it was, and then it would just fall into these bins. And so it was just a lot faster than doing it by hand. And so his horse-drawn mechanical reaper becomes a functional machine, and that also revolutionizes farming. And so farming in the American West continues, and we are able to farm some of that land that is part of the Great Plains because of these innovations. Yes, Braden.
So are things like this steel plow gonna make the like for example the land where the Native Americans were forced to, is that gonna make like that have more appeal to white people so that they're gonna want to move over there and start using it?
Yes, and eventually we are going to colonize the Great Plains. Like, we're going to have people move out there, and that's going to be like after the Civil War, the 1870s, 1880s, with the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad and the Homestead Act and all of that. But Oklahoma will actually be kind of surrounded on all sides by white settlers eventually. And like, this is like in the late 1880s, like early 1890s, there's like going to be all of this jealousy again by white people surrounding Oklahoma who want to start their own farms. And by this time, the technology is even more advanced. But they're going to basically put pressure on the federal government to basically reduce the size of the Native American reservation lands, which there's going to be this act of Congress that does that. It's called the Dawes Severalty Act. And that will make it so there's this big land rush on Oklahoma, and eventually Oklahoma will also be colonized as well. All right, that takes us to another inventor. This guy lives the quintessential inventor story. His name is Charles Goodyear, and yes, there is a company that is not a company started by him, but it was named in his honor, that has to do with rubber.
Yeah, the tires.
Yeah, what now?
I
Kenzie?
believe it was for tires.
Yeah, for tires, Goodyear tires, yeah. And so he basically, for many years, was a penniless inventor. He was obsessed with the idea that rubber, which was actually developed from the sap of trees in Africa, and there was this big rubber trade that was going on around the world because it did have some significant uses, could be made into a much easier to deal with material by combining rubber with a certain chemical. And so he had been working on this process for years. And by the way, again, this is more AP World, AP Euro. There's a dictator over in Africa. He's the king of Belgium, Leopold II, who forces the African people there in that particular region, the Belgian Congo, which would later become Zaire and then the Democratic Republic of Congo, to basically produce a certain amount of rubber, or they would go in and kill people for not producing enough rubber. But anyway, he kept on trying to find a way to make it so where rubber was no longer sticky, kind of like what you would have when you have one of those kneaded erasers, and it's like you can kind of like pull it and twist it and stuff, and it could endure extreme temperatures of both hot and cold. And eventually he was able to perfect this process by combining rubber with sulfur. And this is a process known as vulcanization. But by this time, he and his family had been living in an attic. He had been continuing to run these experiments with almost no money. And his wife and his kids were miserable and starving. And finally, I think, he lost his family and everything. But eventually he gives us this gift of vulcanization, but boy, does he end up consuming a lot of his own life trying to get there. And then later, a tire company is going to be named in his honor. So that is Charles Goodyear and vulcanized rubber. All right. There is a war between lumberjacks in the upper reaches of Maine and Canada. And actually, there's people in the Canadian province of New Brunswick, which becomes known as the Aroostook War or the Lumberjack War. So there's an American census worker in this disputed region called Madawaska, and he's arrested by British forces and commanded by Romain Jean Michaud. And so Maine then assembles a 200 men to resist British aggression. And Congress actually backs them up with an $800,000 appropriation to send in more troops. So it looks like we're going to have a full-blown war with Canada, kind of, reigniting the whole War of 1812 thing. But before the two sides could fight, one of our generals, General Winfield Scott, actually rushes diplomats up to the scene, and we are able to negotiate a kind of a truce to end this. But that basically kind of indicates to everybody that there is a dispute as to where the border between Maine and Canada actually lies. So that is going to lead to a later treaty, which will resolve that particular issue. So it's kind of funny. It's known as the Lumberjack War or the Aroostook War. Also, another little kind of lesser known war that happens in what is now New York. It was the state of New York, was where there were these wealthy landowners in New York known as patroons. Okay, so they didn't have plantations. What they did was they allowed white farmers to rent land from them and farm. So the Dutch patroons, those patroon families had kind of kept their land when New Amsterdam became New York. So when a wealthy patroon by the name of Stephen van Rensselaer III dies in 1839, the executors of his will basically say that rents are going to be raised to pay his debts. And so the farmers who leased the land refused to pay the higher rents, and his sons then tried to have the renters evicted so they could bring in renters who would do it. And the anti-renters put up an armed resistance to the sheriff and the forces that were trying to evict them. And they put so much pressure on elected officials that eventually they had to make concessions. And the renters would actually dress up in these costumes, some of which were made to look like wild animals. And they called themselves Indian Raiders to make it so, they would basically be, they wouldn't be prosecuted, it was just be like, oh, Indian raids. But rent became impossible to collect, so eventually these patroon ships were broken up as a result of the anti-rent war. And these big kind of wealthy landowners in New York were forced to sell off chunks of their land and no longer rent them out. This is going to get us into some cultural stuff, but there are some big advances in painting and in literature during this time. So in the 1830s, there was an artist by the name of Thomas Cole who started a new school of art called the Hudson River School. And really, artists in America began to focus on the majestic landscapes of the frontier. And really, this kind of is celebrating this almost, mythical American wilderness that was just, like people around the world were just kind of like, enthralled by the beauty of the American West. And so as Cole's students kind of began to adopt his style, you had the people like Frederick Edwin Church and Albert Bierstadt, who became very popular for their paintings. And these tried to basically capture this incredible beauty of the American West, and just the sublime majesty of many of these landscapes. So this, of course, is part of a bigger movement in art and literature at this time in history known as Romanticism. And there is a group of writers who also kind of becomes part of this movement. And they create kind of a distinctly American genre of literature. And they're known as the Knickerbocker Group because there was a magazine that published a lot of these stories that they wrote. And it was edited by Charles Fenno Hoffman, called the Knickerbocker. And so you had novelists like James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote The Last of the Mohicans, which was about the time of the French and Indian War. It's been made into a movie since then. Washington Irving really became one of the great American storytellers with his short stories like Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And William Cullen Bryant was a transcendentalist who was also a poet and a playwright. And actually, it's kind of interesting. Some of the holidays and the legends that we have surrounding holidays come from some of these writers. For instance, Washington Irving is the one who originates kind of the whole Santa Claus thing, which by drawing on old German stories and whatnot, he kind of ends up creating these stories which become part of American folklore and then eventually become part of the holidays that we celebrate in America. So very, very influential group of writers. Oh, actually, yeah, I was just about to get to that, actually. So Washington Irving really has a profound impact. He was born into a middle-class family in New York City and took an early interest in writing, and basically made his literary debut with Letters on Society and the Theater, which he published in the Morning Chronicle in 1802. And basically, he became famous for writing books. So Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow become part of his contributions to American folklore. And he also has a big impact on kind of the American version of the Christmas story, where he has Saint Nicholas soaring over the treetops in a flying wagon. So that is Washington Irving, who also had a deep interest in Native American culture as well. Another one of the great leaders of American literature at this time is Nathaniel Hawthorne, and oftentimes you read his works as a part of your American literature classes. So I don't know if you all have read The Scarlet Letter or The House of the Seven Gables, but many of his works are a critique of the early American Puritans. So The Scarlet Letter is about this lady who is accused of adultery, and she has to wear this large scarlet A on her chest at all times, so everybody knows that she's an adulteress. And so this is a movement in literature known as dark romanticism, where they're telling a romantic story, like a story where you have heroes and villains and whatnot, but they're kind of also kind of talking about they're doing a social critique. And so he really kind of is making Puritanism and the early Puritans look bad in the way that he structures his stories, because eventually he will in the story, the man who committed adultery with the lady who has the A on her chest will be revealed to be the preacher in the town. And so he actually also works as an agent during this time at a customs house to support himself and his 3 children. And he was actually appointed the U.S. consul to Liverpool during the Pierce administration a little later on. But Hawthorne will become part of this group of very liberal authors and cultural leaders who will attempt to kind of get involved in some more communes and experiments with communes and whatnot as we get further into the 1800s. All right. One of the greatest American authors of this time is Herman Melville, who basically went largely unrecognized in his lifetime for the true depth of his genius. But in the 1840s, he wrote a book about, and he actually had some experience as a sailor. And he, and that was Moby Dick. And then his popularity waned, and he ended up having to spend years as a customs clerk in order to make ends meet. But Moby Dick told the story of the relentless Captain Ahab and his search for this white whale who was his enemy. And that became an allegory for so many things, it's almost like, to a certain extent, like a philosophical allegory of a man chasing, a certain unattainable thing all his life, and it becoming kind of his mortal enemy. But also it was an allegory for imperialism during the late 1800s, which was something that many European nations engaged in, and they were pursuing their own dreams of world domination and glory and whatnot. So very powerful kind of piece that or novel that really had a long-lasting influence. And there was also another group of American poets at this time who were in some ways kind of like the great British poets. You have your great British romantic poets, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and all of the others who become kind of this poet glitterati. Well, we have that here in America as well. Alfred Lloyd Tennyson and others were part of that British group. But the fireside poets who became very popular in America and who wrote poems about great heroic, deeds and were part of this Romanticism movement were Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, William Cullen Bryant, the Transcendentalist we mentioned earlier, James Russell Lowell, and John Greenleaf Whittier, who wrote Snowbound, and Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote Ironsides, Old Ironsides. By the way, Bryant's Thanatopsis is considered to be one of the greatest works of the Transcendental movement. Oftentimes when you are in American literature class and you're in your unit on Transcendentalism, Thanatopsis is one of the poems you read. And of course, Longfellow became famous for his epic poem Hiawatha, which goes way back to the very beginnings of the Iroquois Confederacy and the great prophet Hiawatha, who founded the Iroquois Confederacy. So that is the Fireside Poets, and that takes us to Olivia's slide. So Olivia, are you still with us?
Yes.
All right, great. So you are up for Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay, so to start off, he was the son of actor and actress David and Elizabeth Poe, and turns out his mother died shortly after, and his father left him by the time he was 2 years old, so he turned into a foster child. And he was taken into the home of a wealthy merchant named John Allen along with his wife. And Poe was close to his mother, but his father thought he was ungrateful for all that they have done for him. And that's something that I kept seeing, but I didn't really see why his father thought that way. But yeah.
Okay.
And
yeah, he kind of has this abusive situation to a certain. He's emotionally abused, which is going to affect his writing in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And later on, Poe attended the University of Virginia, and I saw that where he excelled in his classes, but he was too poor to continue on with them because his father didn't give him any like tuition money or anything like that. So he was kind of on his own with that.
Yeah. Just
Yeah.
not a good relationship between him and
Yeah, it really wasn't. It was very abusive.
yeah. Go ahead.
So, basically, poverty forced him to go to the army after that because he couldn't continue on with the university. And shortly after joining, his foster mother died. So, John Allen purchased his release from the army and helped him get an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy in West Point, which I thought was kind of weird because that seemed kind of like a bipolar decision based on all the other decisions. So I was just going to ask if you knew why he did
Okay.
that.
Okay, so John Allen, from what I have seen on this, because I don't have a deep knowledge of their family life, but I do remember reading about this. John Allen was like all about Edgar Allan Poe not being one of these artsy fartsy, literary people, but he wanted him to be a real man, and he wanted him to go and get involved in like the manly pursuits of the military and whatnot. So if he didn't do what his dad wanted, because really he is a gifted writer, he's a brilliant man. But if he didn't do what his dad wanted, then his dad would fight back by not giving him money and treating him like crap. But when he did what his dad wanted, then his dad would be like, okay, yes, now I'm going to support you, son.
Like all nice, yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of the vibe I got from him.
So anyway.
Yeah. So in between all of these things, he did publish many volumes of books. And from what I've noticed, it was things I've never heard of. So I just kind of assumed a little bit that they never really gained popularity like he wanted them to. And so he got that appointment to the U.S. Military Academy. And of course, shortly after, he was bored of the military after a year. So he would intentionally miss all the drills and classes for a week so they would expel him. And turns out he successfully did get expelled and returned to New York and Baltimore to publish more works. And that was all I got from that kind of time period. And
do you have his marriage to his young cousin?
yeah, I do. Yeah, so later on, he ended up marrying his 13-year-old cousin when he was 27.
Oh, wait. So everybody just let that sink in for a second.
Yeah.
How old was she?
13, and I read that it was his first cousin, so it's not like some third distant cousin. It was his cousin.
He married a 13-year-old. Yeah. So anyway,
yeah.
Kenzie and Laura.
I thought that was whack. It's whack in general, but I read it and I'm like, oh, okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Hold on. We got some hands up here. Kenzie, go ahead.
Was it from his foster family or from his biological family?
I'm not sure. I could not find that. I just knew that it was like his first cousin. That's all I could find.
That's pretty whack.
From his foster.
Yeah.
Still, the fact that she's 13 is like, I can't get to that, but okay. But Lauren, go ahead.
So, if she was his first cousin, does that mean he was related or she was related to his mom's side or his dad's side? Because it's like you said, like he had a very bad family life, so I don't know why he wouldn't go live with them, I guess. Instead of, I don't know.
Yeah, he's Olivia, I don't know if you want to jump in on this, but
yeah, I didn't find anything on that kind of thing either. I just kept seeing that he married a 13-year-old. So
this is a first cousin to his foster family. So technically it's not the marrying someone too close to you blood wise, the whole incest thing, because it's his foster family. Like he's not blood related to those parents. So that doesn't really people aren't like taken aback by that. It's just that, and this was actually something that happened more often than you think it did, but a lot of times older men would take advantage of younger women, and this was a practice that was common in both Europe and in America throughout the 1800s. even into the 1900s. Like Hitler's father, Aloy Hitler, married his young cousin, Clara, and she became Clara Hitler. And then, they had a very abusive, dysfunctional household as well. And that's in the that's like, what was that? Like 19, like, oh, something. I can't remember exactly the year. But anyway, yeah. So, I mean, but like, how can you have a like normal, like healthy marriage if there's that much of a difference and one of the people is essentially a child? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like, yeah, go ahead.
The way I kind of looked at it was, when you read like first cousin, your brain's like, oh, she's like related to him and whatnot, but really it's not. You said it was on
It was in
his mother's side, right?
well, as far as I remember, it was to the foster mother. So remember,
Yeah.
he was not blood related. So there's no blood relation issue. It's the issue that a lot of people have with it, including me, is like that she's just so young.
She is very young, yeah. Weird.
So
And
anyway,
then, of course, to add to the trauma, she died 2 years later of tuberculosis. And turns out, like, basically all of his works after that, from what I gathered, was that her dying inspired a lot of things like The Raven and The Pendulum. And I've read both of those, and they're kind of dark a little bit.
actually, with the pit and the pendulum, is like this. Like he goes back to the Inquisition, and these tortures in the Inquisition, and this guy who is like, under one of those tortures, and the Raven is this poem, and I don't know if you all have heard like some of the lines from there, but it's like, quoth the Raven, nevermore. Is what he always goes back to that refrain. Yeah, Nick, what were you gonna say?
Was his like kind of very depressing style of writing unique for his time, or were
Yeah,
other
it's
people?
part of a new genre. I was actually just about to say that. Olivia, do you have that new genre that he kind of is one of the pioneers of?
Wasn't it like horror, kind of? Not
It's
really, but
it's called Gothic. Yeah,
yeah.
this is Gothic literature where it does have this horror element to it. So like the Fall of the House of Usher is also very dark, and so all of these things have this kind of like, I don't know how to say it, but just like this hopelessness about them.
Yeah, and it influenced a lot of like sad writings that he wrote, from what I took from it.
Well, you're going to have this whole kind of genre that comes out of his
Yeah.
very depressed way of looking at life.
Yeah.
He's just an odd
Well,
man.
his whole life was kind of depressing, so I can see why.
Yeah. And Nick, you have your hand up still. Did you want to say anything else?
I forgot, but actually, I'm going to try to think of a question. Hold on.
Okay, yeah. If you could, we'll come back to you in just a bit. So go ahead, Olivia.
And the next thing I found was also because of all of that, he turned into kind of like an alcoholic. I saw something from that. And then people started rumors that he was a drug addict. But then continuing on, I found that according to like medical history, he had a brain lesion. From those can be caused by trauma or disease. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but I don't know if it's true or not.
Yeah. So I mean, it just keeps getting weirder and weirder with him. Like he's
Anything bad, it sounds like I kept reading more about him and I'm like, oh well, this other bad thing happened to him. He has this brain lesion that's caused by all this trauma. So
yeah, but I mean, in order to kind of come up with this like really horror based way of looking at life where you're so incredibly depressed and fatalistic, you almost would have to have like, some of these issues or whatever. But
yeah.
But anyway, go ahead. I'll let you continue.
Okay, so he ended up dying when he was 40, and I couldn't really find like a definite reason on why he died. I saw different things from like suicide, flu, stuff like that. And that's as far as I got with him. I tried to find the paradox thing, but I Didn't really understand what was going on with that.
Okay, he is all he's basically kind of this is a scientific paradox, and I'm gonna. Oh, Nick, did you think?
Oh my god. Sorry.
Nick.
Yeah, I was gonna. Did his like biological father like ever come back into his life again, or like comment on him or anything, or did he just leave?
I can't remember, but I know that him dropping out of West Point was a huge disappointment. Like he had his foster father had like done a lot to get him into West Point, and it had spent a lot of money to get him into West Point, but it just wasn't his thing. So yeah, I did. You find anything on that, Olivia?
I did not.
Okay, yeah. So as far as I know, yeah, they did not have a good relationship. But basically, that is Edgar Allan Poe. So, but yes, let's go back to the Olbers paradox thing. So, the question is, in a in a universe where you have lots of like points of light, why isn't the night sky just as bright as the day? Like, why is it that the night sky is so dark? Because if you take a whole bunch of candles and you put them into a room, the room is going to become bright. And if you think about the number of stars that are out there, like, why is the night sky so dark and so black? Instead of being, like in like, honestly, like if we're looking and counting the number of stars currently according to what we now have as our ability um to like see, how many stars there are, so to speak, like there's a lot of them out there. I mean, it's almost like to the point of being infinite, like that we just can't count them all. So why isn't all of space just lit up like with all this light? Why does the night sky look dark rather than light? So before I give you his solution to this, do anybody want to take a stab at why why is it? Maybe I want to try like solve the paradox. Go ahead, Zach.
My guess would be that they're so incredibly far away.
Okay. And then and that is, again, it's like, but that light, which may have been traveling for like, millions of years, when it gets here, why isn't there more of it? And Max, what were you going to say? Max, you had your hand up?
I was just going to say it's because they're really far away, but I guess it's because they're probably hitting things along the way.
You're on the right track. Zach, what were you going to say?
I was just saying, like, they're not like a little far away. It's like if I stuck you in a room and then I lit a candle in China and said, "Can you see the light?" It's like, of course you can't see it because it's so far. It's incredibly far away.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So you guys are on the right track. And here's what Edgar Allan Poe basically said. He says that there is a finite universe that we can see. Okay. But because the universe is like, it has an age. It's there's like a time when there was no universe. Like there is a big bang, and then before that there's nothing. There's basically a lot of those the light from those stars that are really, really far away just hasn't gotten here yet. And so the speed of light is a finite thing. It's not infinite. And so, yes, like if you had an infinite number of points of light and you stuck them all into a room, they would all kind of eventually light the room up, and it would be a really bright room. But because of it's just very unlikely for light to travel and to hit the Earth from so far away. And like once you get like past like a certain finite, like number of light years. Like light can only travel so far in a year. Once you get past that, the light just hasn't had a chance to get to us. Braden, what were you going to say?
So basically, what you're saying is Zach is right. They're just so far away, the light hasn't gotten here yet, and that's the problem.
Okay, Zach basically gave us the Edgar Allan Poe answer to the Olbers paradox, but there is a more modern interpretation, and that is that there is a lot of dust out there. Like there is a lot of dust out in interstellar areas and in intergalactic areas that is just not accounted for often, and that dust just blocks a lot of the light. So there's a lot of little like detritus and dust and whatnot. So that goes along with what somebody else was saying, where it's like it hits things. It it runs into things on the way. And so like the light waves that would have gotten here, there's fewer of them that make it because of that. So it's a combination really of both, is the answer. But that is, so I mean, to be thinking about things like that and then to offer a viable solution to Olber's paradox, this has to be a brilliant guy. We have to, when we look at Edgar Allan Poe, we have to acknowledge that for all of his weirdness and for all of the things in the decisions he made that we may completely disagree with, he at least was a brilliant man. Like he is absolutely brilliant. And of course he does kind of end up starting his own genre of literature, and you would have to be brilliant to do that. Olivia, what were you going to say?
I guess just another thing I was gonna add was, like, when I was reading about his childhood, he did kind of seem like the troublemaker kind, but it was because he was always forced to do something he didn't want to do, like the military thing. And when he ends up going through all of these things and writes all these amazing books that he has, I do have to admit, like, none of his books are boring that I've read. Like, all of them are interesting in their own little way, even though some people viewed back then as him being the weird guy.
Yeah, I mean, you almost get the same chilling feeling from some of his stuff.
It's a different feeling. Like, when I read some of them, I'm like, ooh.
Yeah, but like, it's almost like reading some of Shakespeare's stuff. Like Shakespeare is just absolutely brilliant in his own right. But I guess there's this fine line between brilliance and madness or whatnot. I don't know. But it takes a certain amount of crazy, I guess, to really kind of break through and do something different, do something new. Yeah.
Yeah, he just has a different train of thought.
He's an
I guess.
He's an odd man, yes. And then Autumn, what were you going to say?
Like you just said, he seems like a really, really smart person. So was the only reason he did in the army because he didn't want to?
You were breaking up, so I couldn't quite hear you. Like, only some of your words came through. Can you say that one more time?
Okay. So like you just said, he seems like a really smart person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the only reason in school and in the army, is that just because he didn't want to do it, or was there something else?
Some people just have an inner drive. Like there is something inside of them that they just want to do. Like they're kind of almost born to do it. Like they just have a talent, they're born with a talent and they want to express that talent. And his talent really is as a writer. I mean, he's just an amazing writer. But his foster dad is like, that's a stupid, thing to waste your life on when you could be in the military, you could be a success. And so there's this kind of classic struggle, which you've seen, time and time again between fathers and sons over like, what a son should do with his life. The son wants to follow his own inner drive, the things inside of him that he enjoys and loves. And then the dad wants him to do something that is considered to be the road to success at the time. Many brilliant people throughout history have been in that same situation. Martin Luther, same thing, him and his dad. So Nick, what were you going to say?
I was going to ask, did he ever get diagnosed with anything during his life, and do we like speculate as to what if he had any mental illnesses or the like? nowadays,
Good
or
question. Like again, the state of psychiatry and like we were talking about with asylums is really at this point in history, it's just like, uh, yeah, this person's got a mental problem. Throw them in the asylum, and then when they're in the asylum, they don't get treated for their actual problem. They just are kind of herded in there, and then they just are like, yeah, we heard about this new therapy that so and so developed, and let's just try it on everybody. And like, so there isn't like a real, like nowadays they diagnose the mental illness and then they treat the mental illness. Back then they're just like, ah, you're an invalid, you're insane, you're this, and then they just throw you in with all the other people, and then there's just like kind of this general, hey, this is what we're going to do for them, but they don't really treat their issue. So yeah, I guess that's my best explanation is, Nick, they didn't really treat things back at this time. Like, really, I mean, the first actual um, treatment of mental issues that is kind of effective and well documented is what is known as the talking cure. And that is pioneered by what the guy who is considered to be the pioneer of modern psychiatry, Sigmund Freud. And he was treating post-traumatic stress disorder from soldiers who had experienced trench warfare in World War I and were just completely like undone by the PTSD, the very significant amount of PTSD they had. So that is when they actually started treating mental illness. Before then, there is no like real kind of scientific discipline to anything. If I don't know, does that answer your question?
yeah, it does. I mean, like, there's no really way of knowing, I guess, if he did. I mean, we can speculate, but there wasn't any way of knowing at the time, probably.
Oh yeah, I would say if I were to just post-diagnose this guy, he was clinically depressed for sure. Like he was
Yes.
definitely clinically depressed. Like it is obvious that he was clinically depressed, and I would not be surprised if his death, which again is kind of questionable, was not a suicide. Um, but yeah, he's got some serious mental issues. So anyway, um, yeah, that's Edgar Allan Poe. And it is sad that he didn't get the help that he needed, or he didn't get to the support he needed to be who he wanted to be. But in spite of all of that, he actually does end up making a huge impact on the history of literature. And we're still talking about him today. I mean, a lot of you guys, when you're in either your high school or your middle school American literature classes, you read him. Like, in spite of like how his dad thought, oh, he'll never be a success, here we are talking about him. Okay, so anyway, Olivia, did you have anything else you wanted to add, quotes, etc.?
I do have a quote, and it's from him, and it says, "I do not suffer from insanity. I enjoy every minute of it." So
I know, yeah, again, that fine line between genius and crazy, which you see in a number of people throughout history. So
a lot of his quotes, like, obviously you don't know if he actually said them or not, but a lot of them were just him, like, not really making a line between insanity and genius. I feel like it was just a lot of him saying, I know I'm insane, and that's what makes me great. I guess that's what I got from that.
he embraces it to a certain extent. He embraces
Yes.
the ultimate tragedy of life, or something along those lines. I don't know how to put it.
Yeah. The way he would say it.
But yeah, like, and some of the stuff he wrote is still part of our popular culture. Like, you'll hear people say, quoth the raven, nevermore. Because a lot of us, like, I remember reading that when I was in, I was either middle school or high school. I read that poem and it stuck with me. I mean, I remember, quoth the raven, nevermore. You see that sometimes in like YouTube videos and stuff nowadays, because people who are making those, they had to read it when they were a kid. And so, yeah, still part of the popular culture. Even so, an incredible, long-lasting influence in terms of the Gothic style that he ended up creating. All right, that takes us to a slide that I think
That's fine.
Faith and Scott. I saw Scott part of things earlier. Is he still in here? It looks like he left. Okay, so Faith, I'll let you go ahead and do this slide. So go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to start off by addressing, I think Abner Doubleday is how you pronounce his name?
Yes.
He was believed to be the inventor, like he invented it in the summer of 1839. But this is actually considered a myth, also because since he actually never claimed to have anything to do with the invention of baseball. Um, excuse me. That myth was actually a story commissioned in 1907 by, it was known as the Mills Commission. And it was basically founded on the belief that by the testimony of Abner Graves, but he was put in an insane asylum and he died there. So I don't know how much you can trust the testimony of an insane person, but here we go.
Yeah. It's a sad
Uh,
end. The great.
yeah.
Well, go ahead.
So the person who's actually believed to have invented baseball is a man named Alexander Cartwright, who, if he based it off anything Abner Doubleday did, he basically made new rules that would form the basis for modern baseball today. And he made the game more challenging and a bit of a faster pace. So there were like two different clubs. It was the, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. The New York Baseball Club and the Knickerbocker Baseball Club, and they were the ones who had the first ever recorded game on September 23rd, 1845. There are also earlier documentations of it going as far back as March of 1786, which was like mostly a game that were like children were playing. But a lot of people thought that it was really, really similar to cricket. So it's like, did America really do this? The English were being like, yeah, you just based it off of our cricket, like, and the games are very similar. But the Americans were like, mate, just please let us have this. And yeah, so the Americans said, no, it's our thing. We didn't base it off of any of you guys. It's completely ours. And the English were like, yeah, we kind of doubt that, but whatever makes you happy, I guess.
Yeah. Now, what, like, in terms of popular culture nowadays, have American sports gone around the world and
Oh
influenced?
yeah, like with American football and baseball as well, like and basketball as well. I believe that I know that the first net for a basketball was made out of peach fuzz, which that was interesting.
Well, it was a peach basket. The original
Yeah.
James Naismith goal was a peach basket nailed to the wall.
Mhm.
But Zach, what were you going to say?
I was going to say a cool tidbit about the whole international thing. Earlier this year, when all the sports got canceled because of COVID, ESPN actually had the contract with the Korean baseball organization, and they broadcasted their games for like 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah. I will say this, like, just looking over the broad sweep of history, as America, like, because America borrowed a lot of culture for a long time, but then eventually we create our own. As America, like, does start creating its own culture and exporting it around the world, and really becoming kind of a cultural hub almost. One of the great things that we do spread all over the planet is our love of certain sports, baseball, basketball, and football in particular. Baseball, as you see here, may have had some of its early beginnings in the game of cricket, but they made it more competitive and more fun. Basketball is actually invented by a Canadian who is living in America and basically was in charge of a bunch of rowdy young men at a YMCA and who needed an indoor game to keep them busy. And then football is actually like a combination of the rules for rugby and the rules for soccer, which was created by a bunch of guys who were in college who needed something to do. And actually, it was so violent in its early days. We're going to talk about this when we get to the 1920s, that a lot of people died playing it. But we take games that were kind of like little, like, oh, it's, let's knock the ball through the hoop, kind of, like very light, and everybody could just kind of sit and chatter and do things, and then we've turned them into these ultra competitive things because, like, Americans, for whatever reason, are just, there's a ton of really competitive people. And like, I don't know if that's from being in contact with the frontier all the time, or always having to kind of strive so much to make something of yourself and not having, everything kind of settled and whatnot. But the sports we have invented have really had such a massive impact around the world. It's just kind of amazing to see that. So Faith, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh no, you're fine. You're fine. I will say, like, and along with what you said, cricket was kind of seen as an uppity sport. Like, it was mostly the rich people who were like, "Oh, let's go out and have a round of cricket." Like, it wasn't.
Right.
Everybody kind of knew how to play, but it was mostly enjoyed by rich people. Like, you dressed up to play cricket. You know, you didn't have like the cool like baseball uniforms or anything like that like we have today. You didn't get dirty or anything like that. You weren't like sliding into bases and everything like that. Cricket was more posh, I guess would be a word that I could use there.
Yeah,
So yeah, Americans basically said, yeah, where's the fun in that? And we just kind of turned that on its head, and we said, yeah, let's hurt each other when we're doing these, because otherwise it's not as fun.
Right.
Which, I mean, fair, I guess. That's fair.
Yeah. So go ahead. Do you have anything else beyond what you've already talked about in terms of the origin of baseball?
No, I do not as of
Yeah.
right now, no.
And just Kenzie, go ahead. What were you going to say?
You mentioned the first game. I'm sorry, I missed it, but who did you say it was in between?
Oh, the first recorded game was between, there were two clubs who played baseball at the time, and that was between the New York Baseball Club and the Knickerbocker Baseball Club. And that was on September 23rd, 1845.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was played in New York as well. I feel like that's important to mention.
Yeah.
And then, like, it grew steadily more popular and then kind of became known as America's pastime.
Right. Yeah, and actually, we're going to have two more slides on baseball at least. I think maybe possibly three. We're going to come back and keep looking at the growth of the sport as time goes by. So this is at its very, very early stages, but we'll come back to it in like the mid to late 1800s, and then we'll come back to it again when it's really a big deal in the 1920s in the age of Babe Ruth and all of that. So yeah, so it's really our oldest sport, and it's still popular today. And so that is American baseball, and that takes us to politics. And so in the campaign of 1840, the years of economic grief and toil had in the Panic of 1837 had considerably dimmed the hopes of Martin Van Buren that he would win in the next election. And so yes, Max, what were you going to say? Max. Oh, okay. I thought I saw.
That was an accident.
Oh, there's an accident. Okay. But the Whigs basically painted him as an aristocrat, and Charles Ogle of Pennsylvania basically said that Martin Van Buren had a, quote, royal establishment in Washington and dined on fine china while the people of America starved, and in the economic depression that had been created. The Whigs were ecstatic. Okay, they knew that they would probably win. So they kind of take a page from the Democratic playbook and they nominate a popular military hero, kind of like what worked with Jackson will work with somebody else. And they nominate William Henry Harrison, the guy who had polled the best out of the three candidates that they had run in 1836. And of course, he was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, which had broken up Tecumseh's Confederacy. And they chose John Tyler of Virginia as his running mate, even though John Tyler was really not in favor of many Whig policies. They were trying to kind of bring moderates in to their campaign. And he ran on a very popular campaign slogan. So that, again, this is kind of showing how advertising and slogans really can affect elections and whatnot. And so the slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. They kind of built their own grassroots organization similar to Jackson's Democratic Party organization, and they sponsored rallies across the country. And they said Harrison is a man of the people. He he lives in a log cabin and he drinks hard cider just like you do, but actually that wasn't true. He lived a very kind of like rich and posh lifestyle and was not born in a log cabin or anything like that. So that is the campaign of 1840. Again, you can see a lot of similarities to politics today in how that was run. And in the election of 1840, and by the way, notice how they don't, like, the Democrats are so depressed that they don't even nominate anybody to be the vice presidential candidate. They were trying to not upset people in the South by not having Richard Johnson on the ticket this time. And Harrison basically wins, and you can see that he's able to take some important states, as you know, up throughout the Midwest, even in the South. So he is a candidate that isn't regional. He's appealing to both Northerners and Southerners, and so kind of the anti-Jackson coalition. They don't depose Jackson himself, but they do depose his successor, Martin Van Buren. And so you, in order to be considered a major party in American politics, you have to win a presidential election. You can't just capture some states, you have to win a presidential election. So with this win in 1840, the Whigs officially become the other big political party in our country. And of course, a lot of what you saw in that campaign is about creating an image that people would like and that would resonate with people, without necessarily having to live up to that image and being and actually being true. Again, something that you still see in politics today.
Dr. Johnson, I have a question.
Go ahead.
So looking at the difference between the popular vote and the electoral vote,
yes,
like that's like it was really close on the popular vote, but with the electoral vote, like it's a landslide for Harrison.
Right.
Like, doesn't that just kind of show that this isn't like a good system for representing like the what the people want?
Well, okay, and here's the argument, both pro and con. So your argument is kind of the con to the electoral system, which is it's like it doesn't really represent the popular vote. Like it's but the pro to the electoral system, kind of the counter argument to that is that if you only went by popular vote, then candidates would only visit the major metropolitan areas. Like they would spend almost all their time in, like, if you're gonna do that nowadays, they would spend almost all their time in New York City and the major cities of California, and they would just ignore the rest of the country. So in order for the interests of the kind of the small people, the people who live in the other parts of the country to be recognized, the electoral system, the kind of, I had a picture of that. Oh, I don't know where it is. Yeah, I'll have to find it. I'm going to find that picture. But anyway, it basically kind of gives the state less population than. All right. So, Zach, what were you going to say? We're still having that debate nowadays as to whether it's an outdated system, by the way, or not.
Yeah,
Zach?
so I actually do know a lot, quite a bit about William Henry Harrison.
Oh.
So I was wondering if I could just talk about that and get some more credit for the.
Actually, we are out of time. It is about 2:00. So.
I mean, there's not a ton of information on him. Can I just do it real quick to make sure I have all the credit I need?
Well, actually, I was like, okay, I don't want to like go over the limit here. Can you want to do it in class and get credit for it that way? Because I think you've gotten credit for yeah, you're good credit for today. But Olivia, what were you going to say?
I just had a question about I don't know how to pronounce his name. Martin. I'm just gonna call him Martin.
Martin Van Buren?
Yeah. It says in the campaign of 1840 that his chances were dimmed by the years of economic depression. And I know he was in office, like right when that happened, but wasn't that not his fault?
Right. Again, we're looking back with the benefit of 2020 hindsight because we see the history. We can go back and read the sources. We can go back and figure things out. But back at the time, it was like, no, he didn't really, like people didn't get it. Like they're in the middle of a depression and they want somebody to blame. And they just blame the guy in charge. So like, it must be his fault. People don't always make the most logical well-informed decisions, especially when they're hurting and, you know, they're a little on the emotional side about things. So, so yeah, it's not really his fault. But, you know, he suffered the consequences. You're going to see that with a lot of presidents, like Herbert Hoover with the Great Depression. You know, if you're in charge when something terrible happens, and it hurts people economically, by and large, the American public has blamed the person in charge. That has been true. It'll be true of another president, Grover Cleveland. It'll be true even of a war hero president like Ulysses Grant, with other panics like the Panic of 1873 and the Panic of 1893. So
fun.
yeah, so you'll see it again and again, like over and over again. It just keeps happening. So it tends to be one of the cardinal rules of politics for whatever reason, even though it's not really, there's not really a good reason for it. So yeah, so Zach, if you were going to talk about like the very short time that Harrison was in office, you know, I'll probably want to save that because we just don't have enough time. But did you want to say anything regarding him as a candidate or anything like that before?
No.
Okay, all right. So
I just know everything that happened to him in office. It's
okay.
not much, but.
So, all right. Well, when we cover it in class, which we'll do on Monday, you know, I would love to hear all of the stuff that you have on him. But we'll have to stop it here, and I'll make sure I give you credit, even though you were kind of like unable to share with us because of time constraints. So, thanks everybody for being a part and for being willing to kind of let me kind of add that extra hour in to make up for Wednesday. And I will see you all on Monday in class.
Just to be clear, this extra hour was basically what our work quote would be.
Right.
Or is it? Okay,
right.
cool.
So we were able to cover slides that would have like been like I'm just trying to keep us up, like caught up to where we're supposed to be slide wise. And we're still kind of a little behind on that. But this would have like Monday and Wednesday in class, this was to make up for how far we would have gotten basically by Wednesday, to try to keep us on track so we're not like super far behind and having to make up a lot at once later on. So,
yeah.
All right. So thanks everybody, and I will see you all later.
Have a good day, Dr. Thompson.